My name is P.R. I am the co-chair of the ASSOCHAM National Council of Banking. We're all gathered here today to discuss a very, very important element, which is essentially the one-time restructuring of financial assets that's been allowed by the Reserve Bank of India. And we are very, very pleased and glad we have such an august panel. We were to have been joined by our General Secretary General, Mr. Deepak Sood. Unfortunately, he got called away at the last minute. But in his stead, I will read out his speech, and then we will take it forward from there. So once again, thank you very much for joining us today, and I'm looking forward to a very, very interactive and useful session as we go forward. So, good morning, everybody. Mr. Subhash Chandran, former Finance Secretary, Ministry of Finance, Government of India, Shri Ashwin Parekh, Managing Partner, Advisory Services LLP, and member of RBI Expert Committee on One-Time Restructuring, Ms. Padmata Chunduru, MD and CEO, Indian Bank, the ASSOCHAM esteemed timely and meaningful interactive session. On behalf of ASSOCHAM, I extend a very warm welcome to all of you at the ASSOCHAM virtual interactive session on one-time restructuring. The RBI had initially allowed bankers to grant a loan moratorium for 3 months on equated monthly installments falling due between the 1st of March and the 31st of May 2020. Later, it was extended for another 3 months until August the 31st. To manage the financial stress amidst the lockdown, the Reserve Bank of India has recently permitted banks to go for one-time restructuring of loans that are facing stress due to COVID-19 crisis with a view to mitigating risks to the financial system, and I may add, with a view to ensuring that all viable institutions that exist in our country continue to remain in existence and provide continuing employment to those that currently work there. For the prudential framework issued by the Reserve Bank of India on the 7th of June 2019. This is a major relief to corporates and retail borrowers. With an intent to facilitate revival of real sector activities and mitigate the impact on the ultimate borrowers, it has been decided to provide a window to enable the lenders to implement a resolution plan in respect of eligible corporate exposures without the change in ownership and personal loans, while classifying such exposures as standard, subject to specified conditions. The underlying theme of this resolution window is preservation of the soundness of the Indian banking system. Bankers have pitched in for one-time loan recast on accounts facing challenges due to the pandemic. The IBA has also given its recommendations to the Reserve Bank of India. The Reserve Bank of India constituted an expert committee on 7th of August 2020 under the chairmanship of Shri V.K. Financial parameters to be factored in. May I request you to please put yourself on mute, because there's a lot of background noise which we could avoid. The Reserve Bank of India constituted an expert panel on the 7th of August 2020 under the chairmanship of Shri K.V. Kamath to make recommendations on the required financial parameters to be factored into the resolution plans under the resolution framework for 2019 COVID-related stress, along with sector-specific benchmark for such parameters. The eligibility for the under the resolution framework as of the 6th of August is as follows. Resolution under this framework extended only to borrowers having stress on account of COVID-19. Only those borrowers who are classified as standard and with arrears are eligible under the framework. The invocation date and implementation framework are as follows. Resolution framework may be invoked not later than the 31st of December 2020. RP needs to be implemented within 180 days from the date of invocation. The resolution process shall be treated as invoked once lenders representing 75% by value and 60% by number agree to invoke the same. ICA is to be signed by all lenders within 30 days of invocation. Lenders who have signed the ICA to make provisions higher of 10% or IRAC norms. Lenders who have not signed ICA to make provisions higher of 20% or as per IRAC norms upon expiry of 30 days from invocation. The residual tenor of the loans may be extended by a maximum of 2 years with or without payment moratorium. The moratorium period, if granted, shall come into force immediately. Asset classification may be maintained as standard or upgraded to standard subject to the RP being implemented as per the framework. For aggregate exposures greater than 100 crores, an independent credit evaluation is to be obtained from any one credit rating agency authorized by the RBI. The five-member committee under the leadership of Shri K.V. Kamath submitted its report to the Reserve Bank of India. The committee has on the 4th of September, and it has been placed subsequently on the RBI website. The committee has recommended financial parameters that, inter alia, include aspects relating to leverage, liquidity, and debt serviceability. The committee has recommended financial ratios for 26 sectors, which could be factored by lending institutions while finalizing a resolution plan for a borrower. The committee recognized that the COVID pandemic has affected the best of companies. These businesses were COVID basis. Impact is pervasive across several sectors, but varying severity, mild, moderate, and severe. Time is of the essence at the present juncture, considering the large volume and the fact that only standard assets are eligible under the proposed scheme. A segmented approach of bucketing these accounts under mild, moderate, and severe stress may ensure quick turnaround. To complete this task, simplified restructuring for mild and moderate stress may be prescribed. Severe stress cases would require comprehensive restructuring. The task before the committee was to select the set of financial parameters where the threshold has to be recommended for each identified sector. The financial parameters, inter alia, should include aspects related to leverage, liquidity, debt serviceability, etc. Stressed accounts are more vulnerable to disruptions caused by COVID-19 and need optimal support. Restructuring servicing the which have situations on a timely basis but are in monitoring period due to regulatory requirements should be considered as good as standard accounts due to timely servicing of debt obligations. All standard accounts, as on the 1st of March 2020, should also be allowed to be restructured. Companies which might have cleared the overdue subsequently should also be permitted. Restructured accounts classified as NPA due to prudential norms of RBI, but where the conduct of the account is satisfactory, should also be permitted for restructuring. Accounts involving multiple lenders need significant time to finalize broad contours of the resolution plan. Each bank needing to obtain internal sanctions, valuations, allotment of securities, etc., leading to the resolution plan implementation process, which is long and rather tedious. As a consequence, which is longer than the 6-month envisioned by the RBI, and extending it to 9 months may be appropriate. Present circular is born out of extraordinary situation, and each RP would require detailed analysis to reach an appropriate solution, and hence 180-day timeline would be too short for banks for implementing all such RP. And therefore, we recommend an extension to 270 days. Several projects under implementation whose physical progress has been severely affected due to COVID need support. However, the circular does not provide any relief measure for such projects. Circular should also include relief measures for extension of date of commencement of commercial operation, shifting of repayment schedule, etc., for projects under implementation. Valuation of such other securities may be guided by RBI's Master Circular on operation of investment portfolio by banks dated July 1st, 2015. Lenders should be allowed to reverse entire 10% provisioning up to 10% residual debt in line with the 7th of June circular. So with this, I request our chief guest for today, I'm sorry. I request with this. I request Ms. Padmana Chundru to elaborate on the banker's perspective with respect to the one-time restructuring that's been announced by the RBI. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Seshadri. Good morning to all. My special thanks to ASSOCHAM for inviting me to this session. And with this elite panel, I feel really privileged to put forth my views on the banker's perspective about one-time restructuring. Shri Subhash Chandran Garg, Shri Ashwin Parekh, Mr. Pradeep Goyal, and Shri Seshadri, and all the members of ASSOCHAM. I find that ASSOCHAM has been very active in conducting a series of webinars and interactive sessions on various topics through this COVID period. And these are topics of very great relevance to the members. I think this one-time restructuring dispensation of RBI and its implications for the industry is one such important. The one-time restructuring announcement by RBI, it covers all the sectors of the economy. I mean, it covers the retail, it covers MSME, and also the corporates. While MSME restructuring was going on even before the COVID pandemic, because of the general slowdown in the global economy, the retail is something new under this dispensation. And these restructuring packages are more or less structured, non-discriminatory and non-discretionary. That's how the bank boards have also approved them, and these are put on the portals of the websites of the banks. So this is the less than 2 crores. So it is easier for the customer to just check his eligibility and avail of the benefit if he wants it. But I think the more relevant for this group of people is the corporate restructuring, which Mr. Seshadri also laid out all the norms or the criteria that RBI has given in its guidelines. Corporate restructuring is a different ballgame. Restructuring as a concept in India has always had an ominous to it. It meant that a company could not manage its business model, it could not, or it made the wrong choices, or it was too slow to adapt to the changes, or it was either too aggressive or too conservative, whatever. There was a stigma to the company. Apart from that, there was also banks that were under cloud with every bout of restructuring, both for the alleged lack of due diligence or worse, the perception that it was done with the intention of evergreening the loans or hiding it. This time is different. Thanks to the various regulatory and also the government initiatives over the past 2 years, with better focus on disclosures, transparency, banks' balance sheets, the asset quality has improved across the banks, and also there has been an enhancement in the due diligence processes across banks. So the issue of evergreening of loans or banks triggering this sort of a restructuring is not the point here. Moreover, most of the other contributing factor, was the amalgamation of banks. That reduced the number of the weak banks and also improved the bandwidth for RBI to have a oversight of the bigger banks, which actually are in the fray now. So this time is different. Again, I repeat, it is the COVID pandemic that triggered this requirement of a restructuring. It threw the economy, the businesses, the jobs, the livelihood out of gear. If you had to choose between life and livelihood, then the choice is obvious. Just as the Prime Minister said, "Jaan hai to jahan hai," was the mantra for survival as the pandemic raged on. Under these circumstances, the chances of survival and of revival of every sector got impacted, and hence it is important for the state and the regulator to step in to avert a crisis at the whole economy and also at the systemic level. All the benchmarks about sectors and the process laid down for restructuring, where the debt exceeds 100 crores, has already laid out by Mr. Seshadri. Where it exceeds rupees 1,500 crores, there would be a process vetting, like an oversight committee that was earlier there. So RBI has tried. I request people to mute their mics because I think there's a lot of disturbance here. RBI has tried to tailor this only to COVID-affected companies by laying down the account should have been standard and not more than 30 days overdue as of 1st March 20. The financial benchmarks have already been laid out, and these financial benchmarks were to be tested on the balance sheet of 2019. That is the pre-COVID balance sheet. So it was not like under the impact they would be tested. And there was also an appropriate recourse with a realistic holiday period, tenor, and additional funding, etc. The timeline of 180 days from invocation, the invocation itself, the deadline is December 31st, 2020. And so 6 months from there would be June 2021. There are a lot of positives about this dispensation. There is a specific dose for a specific problem. This is COVID-19, so it is a dose for this problem. Earlier, the June 7th circular is already there, which covers restructuring of other issues. Then this also permits restructuring without a change in ownership. Obviously, it had nothing to do with the promoters or the way it was run. It is a sort of a black swan event. The unit will have to think of a new equity structure. The 2 years period actually gives some flexibility for the unit to revisit its business model, its equity model. How would it repay this debt after 2 years or during 2 years, and how would it refinance it? How would it bring in equity? So I think this breathing time for the units is a very big positive. The ICA, 30 days to sign the ICA between the banks, other financial institutions is a tight deadline, but very much required, because otherwise, as Mr. Seshadri says, this is a tedious process. But I think when there are timelines, the banks would work towards that, and it is a do or die situation. You either do the ICA signing, get into those meetings and also thrash out issues, or you make more higher provisions, which also is not very palatable to the banks. The other part that I would take as a positive is that the monitoring of the loan is given equal emphasis after restructuring. The write back of the provision would happen only when certain milestones are reached, like 10% of the debt is recovered and it is on track. The other part, which the divide and rule game that was going on between the, from some of the borrowers, that if it becomes NPA with one bank or a financial institution, it becomes NPA across the board. So this would make all of us work together to see that the unit functions well and everyone gets their share. This is a fair treatment. It also gives the banks a breather in terms of continuing this as a standard asset as long as it performs according to the restructuring plan. The provisioning norm also for corporates, I think, is quite reasonable at 10% and for MSMEs at 5%. With the perceived or the alleged risk aversion among banks, earlier restructuring, there was a lot of blame laid at the doorstep of banks because the lack of due diligence or whatever was perceived. This time, I think with the oversight committee coming in or whatever process vetting coming in beyond 1,500 crores, it's a big comfort to the banks, because if someone does the vetting immediately after the restructuring is done, say within a period of 3 months or so, and then you get some comfort that yes, I am on the right track, and you won't be revisited about this decision after 5 years or 6 years, after you forget all this. So the other part is the disclosures by banks. I think in the balance sheet, we need to give this disclosure about how much of the loans have been restructured, and also going forward, how much of these restructured loans have actually slipped into NPA. So these are all, I think, very transparent mechanisms that are coming in. That said, I think there could have been, like Mr. Seshadri also pointed out, there are some areas that have not yet been addressed, or some areas which could be addressed better. The first point is that the eligibility criteria itself, as of 1st March 20, the account should have been standard. This is presuming that all the problems have come only with COVID pandemic. But there are many units, very well-functioning units, well-managed units, which were in difficulties owing to the global slowdown. And also the trade wars, especially export-oriented units. We find this was going on for some time, and that's why the MSME restructuring came in. But all the units are not captured under MSME. There are mid-corporates. There are even some large corporates, which are in some sectors where the impact is quite high even earlier. So these have become NPAs probably, and they are not eligible for this restructuring. They are only under the earlier restructuring. So this is one thing. Then the benchmarks in some sectors, when we actually get to seeing backtesting which are the units that would work with these benchmarks, there are some issues with some of the sectors. Some sectors have been left out of this 26. There the boards have some flexibility in deciding what can be the criteria. But wherever these 26 sectors are there, we still find that some are not totally fitting in. We need to work it out. And then NBFCs are not covered under this restructuring. So NBFCs are giving their asset side restructuring under the same dispensation, but on the liability side, they are not covered. So this would keep the issues around NBFCs lingering for some more time, especially the smaller and the weaker ones. I'm sure the RBI through its TLTRO and other encouraging initiatives has been taking care of that. Then 2 years is too short a period, especially in severe stress cases. And 180 days may be too short for implementation, which again, I think we had discussed, Mr. Seshadri had mentioned. But I think we need to see how it rolls out. And then as we face the problems, I'm sure RBI and the government would come with some modifications. The scheme is a cautious and calculated measure by the regulator to ensure that the necessary safeguards are in place to maintain financial stability. The Governor RBI mentioned while announcing the scheme that the regulatory approach has to be dynamic, proactive, and balanced. This restructuring is now being tested on all fronts. It is proactive, it is balanced, no doubt. I hope it proves to be dynamic too, with necessary modifications brought in along the way based on the evolving situation. Both the pandemic is also still evolving. There is neither a cure nor a vaccine as we speak today. And the severity of impact on businesses is also still totally not fathomable. It might be deeper than expected. Both the RBI and government have been seeking feedback from the banks on a very regular basis, and also from associations like ASSOCHAM, the industry bodies. I am sure we will be able to face this challenge together and save both the lives and livelihoods in India. Just Jaan bhi or Jahan bhi. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, ma'am. That was a very, very concise, precise position. Appreciate it. You mentioned a black swan event. Just to give context, in standard economic theory, risk is actually broken up. The Chicago school basically said that risk pertains to elements that you know are variable, and that variability is something that you are trying to manage in your business. But outside of risk are these unexpected events that take place, which is not a constituent part of risk itself, which is one of the reasons why banks are finding it so difficult to deal with COVID, because nobody expected it to happen. None of our scenario analysis or plans, we had something of this nature that we had thought of and planned for. So with that, allow me to request a special address. He is a man with an inside track. He was part of the RBI expert committee on the one-time restructuring, so that he can perhaps give us greater insight as to what drove the current policy as it stands. Over to you, Shri Parekh.
The committee started its deliberations, there were a lot of challenges before the committee. I mean, the first major challenge was that the committee had to complete its work within 30 days. And I mean, a problem of this dimension had to be addressed, understood, analyzed, all in 30 days' time. There were a few sort of underlying principles which were established in the terms of reference itself. And that, I thought, really helped us in taking the whole deliberation in a more structured manner. Let me just articulate some of these underlying principles. The first principle was that the asset that we are dealing with are standard assets. So that was the first major underlying principle, with which the committee had to look at. I mean, we know that there have been so many deliberations, so many discussions around what happens to those assets which are facing difficulty before, let's say, 31st of March. But let's put it this way. The appointment, as Madam rightly said, this is purely COVID related sort of package or a COVID related kind of a restructuring program, and therefore the committee was not required to really address the issues which are prevailing. And if we really go into those issues, then there is absolutely no end, because I mean, that the banking system is also as much affected and exposed to this problem as the borrowers are. And if we bring in those issues along with COVID issues, then the dimension and the nature of the problem would change entirely. So the first underlying principle was we dealing with standard assets. What does it do? I mean, this is something very important for everyone to realize. Now that the regulations are out and now that the committee has completed its work, but it's important to know what has gone into, making some of these recommendations. The first important principle was that since we are dealing with standard assets, therefore a lot of issues which pertain only to the resolution process associated with, let's say, NCLT and IBC is certainly not applicable over here. I mean, there were some very underlying, let's say, reasons or factors, which influence, let's say, the working of resolution plans under, let's say, the NPA mechanism of pre 31st March and this one. Since we are dealing with standard assets, the question of the quality of security that the lender possesses, or the question of waterfall after recovery, those do not apply as long as the asset remains standard throughout, pre. Those issues are certainly not there. Friends, you would have noticed that the minute you take out those aspects, then the process becomes far more simpler, easier, and it really empowers the bankers to make decisions. So I would say the first important principle, I mean, there have been requests about NBFCs, there have been requests about infrastructure projects, but I mean, we could have really made the whole thing more complex and difficult, therefore. So I thought we took the benefit of this particular definition of 31st March. We said, let's come out with a program which is simple, where some of those issues which are applicable in the other cases do not apply. So that's the first important underlying principle. The second underlying principle was that the resolution cannot go beyond 2 years. Now, once again, the economic forces and the other uncertainties is something which is very difficult for anyone to really comprehend. I mean, leave aside the committee members. I mean, and also as Madam rightly said, the impact of COVID, how long will it continue? How long will it really take for the pain to really go away, the business to go back to normal, is something nobody can comprehend. Now, in this regard, therefore, the important underlying assumption was that let's also equally protect the banking system. In the sense, I mean, let's make sure that if the bankers come forward and participate in this program, they should not be left with a larger size of problem than they were already sitting with. The same was true the other way around also. If you do not resolve it strictly under the COVID kind of resolution program, then the bankers have a larger problem, because then these eventually go into NCLT, IBC kind of a mechanism, and you have a larger set of problems over there. So we said, let's do a carve out properly. And therefore, we were very glad that NBFCs we were not required to look into, and we were just supposed to come out with financial parameters to ascertain those underlying principles. That is, the asset was actually standard. That within this 2-year time frame, the asset can be resolved and the bankers can start recovering. So that was the second underlying principle. The third one, and this is something where I'll share some of the difficulty that the committee had to face. See, according to the RBI classifications, there are 307 sectors. Now, when we examined these 307 sectors, we realized that there were 3 issues. One is where the sector itself was challenged, even much before the COVID problems began. Then there were sectors which were, doing I mean, well, some of the borrowers may not, but the sectors were doing well. And let's say where the COVID really created more stress. And the third one was that these borrowers, that these sectors were performing well. They were, in fact, regularly borrowing from the system and repaying to the system. They were standard assets. I mean, for a longer period. For a longer period, compared with. So therefore, that's the second category. And the third was purely, that is those who came under COVID kind of a. We were very pleased to see that there were 281 sectors which actually qualified under the third category, which means most of the borrowers were performing, they were standard assets. And because of COVID, they started facing difficulty. They took benefit under that moratorium let's say moratorium regulation, but they couldn't have continued beyond a certain date. So 280 sectors, 281 sectors. The larger challenge there for the committee was, let's focus on these 281 sectors. They account for, and I'll repeat, they account for almost 80% of the total resolution that needs to be carried out. This was based on the data collected from all the stakeholders. We took it from the RBI, we took it from the stakeholders. All the banks participated, they submitted their numbers their details to us, the data to us, sorry. And also the credit rating agency. So all the stakeholders were invited. And then we analyzed that this 281 sectors with simple financial projections. And I'll come to financial parameters. With simple financial parameters, they can be addressed by the bankers. That would make the bankers' task easy, to really arrive at the, let's say, first, to say who to admit. Second, do the resolution plan fall within this 24-month period? Third, if everything meets with the requirement, straight away go into the resolution. So that's how that 281 and 26 sectors have really come about. Financial parameters are also accordingly. So there is what is called a common financial set of parameters which are applicable to all the sectors. 26 are exceptions. People have misread this report. They believe that the report is focusing on 26 sectors. It's actually the other way around. All 281 sectors have been addressed, and 80% of the total exposure of the banking system is really covered under this. Last but not the least, I'll come to this definition of mild, moderate, and severe. And this was very essential because we did not find something like this in all the regulations, including the NCLT ABC process that was there earlier. The concept of assessing the stress and classifying the stress has never been attempted. We said, let's attempt it to make sure that in case of mild cases, and once again, the definition is very clear. The mild cases are those where a simple deferment of principal will really bring the asset back to standard. And therefore, we said that's a mild one. The bankers can straight away address. In fact, some of the requirements associated with even the intercreditor agreement or even the ICE evaluation have also been, to a certain extent, diluted in this regard. So mild is the first one. The moderate is the second one, where there is both deferment of principal and deferment of interest, but no waiver of interest. So if there is a deferment of principal, deferment of interest, then, but within this 24-month period, of course, then it's moderate, where you have, either to, let's say, convert it into equity or where you have to really, but all that is managed within this 24 months period, then it would be a severe sort of, case, and severe cases can be resolved in a certain manner. Automatically, therefore, you will agree with me that the time for resolution will also, the time period over which the resolution can take place will change totally. For mild cases, the bankers and the borrowers need not take long. After the invocation, if the resolution plan is agreed upon by the bankers, they can straight away go into the resolution mechanism. In case of moderate also, something similar will prevail, only in case of severe cases. Then in those cases, let's say a certain order of additional effort, certain order. So things like forensic audit, things like IC evaluation, maybe more relevant over there, just to make sure that there is adequate evidence available with both the borrower and the banker, to say that there was a need for such a resolution, basically. So that's the concept of mild, moderate, and severe. Last but not the least, 26 sectors I'll come to. I mean, we came across one of an important major exposure that the banking system has, and we wanted to really address it, but we couldn't have addressed directly with the RBI terms of reference and the guidelines. And that was the real estate sector is one of the critical sectors from the banking perspective, exposure point of view, and also from the economy point of view. However, we noticed that the problems in this particular sector are prevailing even before 30th of March. Lots of complex issues associated with it. Real estate developers cannot classified uniformly. There is no mechanism available. They are all very different league between urban areas, semi-urban areas. There is a vast difference. There is no single method that can really address, to real estate sector. So we, as let's say, we said that at least in case of those projects or in case of those entities who are nearing completion or who can demonstrate that they can really go under this program and meet with those financial parameters, can really come under this particular one. Airlines or aviation is the other sector we have to address separately. Aviation sector also, once again, you will observe that it's a skewed sector. One or two players are facing difficulty. The rest may come out of COVID within a 24-month period time. Why should they suffer on account of those one or two borrowers, which are a long-term, let's say, problems, is something that kept on coming up again and again in the discussion. And we said, let's address it by financial parameters. And therefore, those financial parameters have been really provided. The same was true with road sector. Roads, some of the roads are performing, some of the roads are not. So therefore, once again, in the infrastructure, we had to take some exceptions, in regard financial parameters. But those are after deliberations to save at least the good borrowers within those troubled sectors, and that's the spirit people have to really understand. So I'll conclude my observations by saying that the underlying principle before the committee for the purpose of this particular program was a simple one. Let's save our dollar. Let's not throw our dollar, behind those assets which may not be able to repay to the banking system, so that at least the others, 80% of the economy, can at least be properly addressed. I mean, that was the underlying principle with which the committee worked. So, I mean, I conclude over here, but I would say once again, the terms of reference were fairly clear. So the committee couldn't have really addressed issues of NBFCs or issues of, let's say, real estate or some of the other sectors which have not been standard assets even before 30th of March. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Mr. Parekh. Thank you very much. That was a very crisp and clear enunciation of the principles that were followed to get us to where we are. I'm sure the intent was the greatest good or the greatest number, and I'm sure that the framework that has been provided will enable banks and NBFCs to provide as much support as is possible, so as to ensure that every viable entity can continue to remain in existence and provide valuable, employment that they currently do. Thank you once again for taking the time to be with us today. Our keynote speaker, Shri Subhash Chandran, who actually requires no introduction. He was the former Finance Secretary of India, the Ministry of Finance, Government of India, and he's been very kind to have joined us today. And we are very, very fortunate to have him with us today, and we are looking forward to hearing from him. Over to you, sir. Are you there, sir? And we seem to have lost him for a minute.
Am I visible? Are you able to?
You're now visible.
All right.
You're now visible, and we can hear you as well.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Seshadri. I am very happy to speak to you all. It was pleasure listening to Padmja and Mr. Parekh. They had the best of the knowledge. They are in the system. They participated. Mr. Parikh participated in the committee itself. So they know the subject much more intensely and densely. And I don't claim to go into that intricacies much more. What I would do today is to focus on the broader aspects, the broader economic aspects of it, and the implications for the banking as well as the industry in terms of growth, in terms of restructuring, what it can happen. So that's what I would try to attempt today. Let me just remind about the broader conclusions of the committee. The committee studied about 52 lakh crores of the loan book of about 92 lakh crores of the in the system which we have. Of that, the committee found that loans of about 15 odd lakh crores, that is about 30%, are the loans which were standard or which were not impacted by the stress prior to the COVID, but were impacted by the COVID. So these are the 15 lakh odd crores of loans which were clearly coming within the sort of broad ambit which was given by the Reserve Bank to them to address. Very large number of loans, something close to about 42% or about 30 lakh crore, about 22 lakh crores of loans were actually in stress prior to COVID. Remaining loans are not even in the situation of stress now or earlier. So I think we have two broad sets of loans to discuss in relation to what the committee's recommendation and the one-time restructuring, which is being recommended to be done. And in that, mainly, we are, I think, more sort of concerned with these 15.5 lakh crores of loans. Now, if you go into these loans, there are various categories which the committee has also sort of put out in the graph. About 1/3 are retail loans and the wholesale loans. So trade loans are the ones which were which got impacted because of the COVID kind of situation, the lockdown. And the rest of the loans are also small, some industry, but mostly the services kind of thing. The bulk of the industry loans were impacted by the stress even before the COVID came in, whether it's power sector loans or the road and others, these were all in that category. So what we are looking at is not an industry-wide or basically industry focused kind of restructuring, which is to take place in line with the recommendations, but more of the services, the retail and those kind of loans. Now, if you again look at the COVID kind of impact which might have caused this stress, there are two events which sort of made their impact on the industry and the services and the businesses. One was the COVID itself. So the COVID made certain kind of better. Let's take example, the IT industry, e-commerce, etc., which in a way got their businesses become better and more profitable after the COVID, because they could compete and they could deliver in the circumstances which were created by the COVID. Then there are industries and the services which were badly impacted by the COVID itself. So take example of airlines, because you have to maintain the distances, you can't run the risk of having an infected person there. So whether it's airlines, travels, entertainment, cinema halls and those kind of things, they were impacted very severely by the COVID itself. The second kind of impact which related to the incidence of COVID was the lockdown. The government decided to save lives, made a decision to have one of the strongest, most stringent kind of lockdown everyone was in a way locked up in their houses, the businesses were closed, production was stopped and all for the greater good of saving the humanity and also to cause much lesser losses on account of the incidence of somebody getting coronavirus and things like that. Those impacts, the lockdown related impacts, are the ones which were temporary in nature. So as soon as the three lockdowns completed in May, more and more of the industry, more and more of the businesses have started sort of coming back to normal. Now the last round of unlock is taking place this month in the middle, and we can say that at least from the benefit of the hindsight now, that 6 months down the line, much of the economy and much of the businesses and industry which were got impacted because the lockdown are now able to operate. So the sum and substance of what I am trying to say is that the COVID related had two impacts. One, COVID itself, and second, the lockdown. The second thing, the lockdown is more or less over. So lockdown related, if you couldn't open your business, your retail business earlier, you can open it now. If you if you could not produce your steel or cement or something earlier, you can now for last quite some times. So the lockdown related impacts are in a way over. What is left now is only the impact related to COVID itself. And there, as I said, some have gained and some have lost. So now to come back to the committee's recommendation and the sector which the committee found were impacted by this stress, this 15 odd lakh crores. I think instead of focusing only on the financial ratios and things like that, the committee and we, now the bankers are the principal parties who are affecting because their loans are unlikely to be paid if someone's business or industry is affected. So banks, the committee, the Reserve Bank, and all of us together in a way, to my mind, sort of look very closely to these 15 or 20 lakh crores of loans from the kind of impact it has left on the business itself. And those would be the ones where the COVID-19 is still lingering. So we should divide these industries or these businesses or the accounts into two parts. One where there was an impact on temporary basis because of the lockdown, and that impact has gone away, but it might have left some temporary impacts on the business or the industry. And the second one is the permanent, more or less permanent or deeper impact which the COVID risk has caused on that business. And then we should attempt how to deal with it. If you look at that, in my judgment, some of the businesses and industry which are deeply impacted by the COVID-19 or the risk of the virus probably will not be able to come back on their own by way of loan restructuring also, even if it is given, even if they are given 2 years or more. I don't think those industries or those accounts can be helped by simple restructuring. If you restructure based on some assumed numbers about what the two years back later the situation would be, it would not remain as a one-time restructuring. It would require again that account to be dealt with. Whereas if you deal or provide the benefit to or restructuring benefit to those accounts which were only temporarily affected because of the lockdown, and their business model and their products are not adversely affected because of the COVID, they are the fittest cases, in my judgment, for being addressed in the form of one-time restructuring. So I would treat the entire stressed account into three categories. One, those whose product is not impacted, whose demand of those product is not impacted. It was affected by temporarily the lockdown. I think those are the accounts which may be falling into what Mr. Parekh was saying as the mild category, on the basis of the outcome, so to say. They are the cases fit enough for one-time restructuring, and restructuring should be attempted for them. The second kind of cases where the industry has got severely impacted because the model change or the demand for those products, I don't think they can be helped by only the restructuring. In this case, either we will have to take a decision that these industries are, or these accounts are allowed to go to bankruptcy and get resolved or liquidated, depending upon whatever the situation is, or that is where I'm coming to the third category, which is a subcategory of this, that the businesses are impacted because the COVID, but with additional investment in digitalization, additional investments in some other ways to take care or remove or restrict the risk. For example, just take, if the cinema halls have to open with 50% capacity, or the airlines have to operate with 50-60% capacity, they would require additional investments. They would come back, right? So that is a third category where additional investment is required to make those businesses viable. In that case, in my judgment, it is the government who should come up with some sort of grant support. The banks cannot provide grants. This debate or this discussion which is going on in the Supreme Court about the moratorium related interest on interest is nothing but actually the attempt to help those ones who probably with little more investment or a temporary support can survive. So I think the third category, I would place it where the government should provide a kind of stimulus package for them. The industry which is impacted severely but can survive and do well with additional investments and kind of thing. So I think this is the way we should deal with it. I wouldn't go into these technical issues. I get a broader sense that the process, though very well targeted and defined and focused on the COVID-related kind of cases, would still run into a lot of procedural and other kind of things, ICA and many other kind of things. So I don't see that this would be easily done in next few months or days. We have not even commenced because there is a case in the Supreme Court and things like that. They have said that you can't take any penal action against that. So I think if we relook at and go back to the drawing boards and into three kinds of things and make an appropriate recommendation to deal with restructuring, bankruptcy or closure, and the government support, then probably we will do it. Banking sector is a very big problematic sector for quite some time. The fact that about 40% of cases are coming prior to the COVID situation. It's in a very fragile conditions. A lot of capital investment has been made by the government and all, especially in PSB. So I don't think that sector can suffer any more of the impact of losses and things like of that type for them. The burden of any relief, etc., has to be taken by the government. I think that is where we can serve our industry and our economy well, and that perhaps might be the better way. I will stop here. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Mr. Garg. That was a very precise kind of argument as to what needs to be done. As you rightly said, the environment has been quite difficult, and even prior to COVID impacting us, there were many that were already struggling, and consequently, any action that is required to be taken to protect industries had to be sharply defined, and it was the decision of the government to focus attention on items that were impacted by COVID. Having said that, may I request everybody to put themselves on mute, if not already on mute? The irony of the situation is that businesses are effectively continuous processes. I mean, they're not designed to stopped and restarted. They find it very difficult to do that. Ironically, the only one business that can actually, be stopped and restarted is actually banking, because we have what is called an accrual book. We don't have to show up to work to make revenues for the next month or the next quarter, because the loans that we've already granted continue to yield us results, which is not the case with other businesses that do not have an accrual book. And so, as Mr. Garg said, the Indian banking industry has been through a reasonably difficult period, because very large chunks of the corporate exposure, specifically over the last few years, have been causing us trouble. And at this, that whatever is done keeps the health of the Indian banking industry intact. Having said that, I think the government's intent is to ensure that every viable business is protected and continues to survive. And the cost of such survival is taken by society as a whole, which in this case, the cost is effectively taken by the government, as opposed to the cost being imposed on other participants within the society itself. So thank you very much, sir, for that very enlightening talk. Thank you for being with us today. We greatly appreciate it. With that, I'll turn this over now to
Thank you
Mr.
very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. To Mr. Pradeep Goyal, who is the co-chair of the ASSOCHAM National Council on ARC and the chairman and managing director of Prudent Asset Reconstruction. So over to you, Mr. Goyal.
Yeah, sorry, I lost your voice, Shadrij, in between. So before we conclude, I would like to ask a question to Ashwinji. If you may please allow me.
Please.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you. Ashwinji, thank you very much for taking this question. Ashwinji, it was really a Herculean task to do this study in 30 days as narrated by you. Actually, I'm surprised on how such a big study was done in 30 days, with a study of 307 sectors and data collection, analysis of the data. Hats off to you and everybody in the committee to achieve that. I have a suggestion that, as we all know, that there is a specific role that ARCs play. ARCs are supposed to be experts in revival. They have a big role to play. We expect as ARCs that our role is recognized and regulator and government supports us in the right perspective. Was it a discussion point during this committee that while you were trying to see what sectors are there, that who all can contribute for rebuilding or revival? ARCs can also be a tool. Today, bankers are not assigning us loans which are early identified loans. They are wary of that because of various regulatory or agencies instructions, even the ministry's instruction to them. We have to follow a long process. So by the time we get it, we are not able to, we are kind of getting dead horses, dead bodies to revive. So was it an option that was discussed, and could it be an option if not discussed before?
No, I mean, quite clearly, the committee did examine the role of the ARCs, and see, basically in this particular case, things were a little different, and then the committee had to examine that. We're dealing with standard assets to begin with, and therefore the assumption was that the resolution process can best be determined by the bankers and by the borrowers themselves. If the borrowers can establish a case that within the parameters they will perform, achieving those financial parameters and within the time frame which has been specified. However, I must admit that the committee did recognize the role for ARCs in the third set of cases. That is where there is a severe, let's say, resolution required. So the services of ARC for the purpose of that resolution may perhaps be called for. You see, there is one dimension that crosses my mind. This has nothing to do with the committee deliberations, but as a practitioner, I have faced this. We have been talking about NPA resolution for the last 10 years now, perhaps more. I mean, ever since the global financial crisis happened, we've been talking about resolution. ARCs came up around that time, and we had a lot of good performance. I mean, ARCs came up as a fallout of SURFACE, but we had a very good period of that, for a certain while. I think what did not get addressed, both by the government and the regulators, and perhaps the ARCs also, was the market for such assets, basically. If you find there is absolutely no, I mean, if you look at the NCLT process or the IBC process so far, you will realize that only in those cases where there were investors who came forward, so there was a small market of investors available for those assets. In case of all other assets, we realized, that there was absolutely no market for, there were no instruments also available for these investors, in this market. So, I mean, as a practitioner, for example, I had 32 to 33 mandates from investors, mostly outside of India. Only 8 could materialize, out of that, for a very simple reason, that the system wasn't ready. The investors, there were so many procedures and things like those. So I would go back to your question, Mr. Goel. The role was recognized. Somehow or the other, the nature of this particular resolution program is very different. It's a play between, as Mr. Seshadri rightly said, or Mr. Garg also alluded to this, it's a play between the bankers and the borrowers, quite honestly. If the borrower prepares his resolution plan or has some idea about his debt servicing and his cash flows, and he takes it to the bankers and the bankers are convinced, then the resolution can really take place much faster. So, I mean, the whole point of this one was to enable the bankers, quite honestly, to make decisions, to go into those resolution plans, attend to those resolution plans, and then, I mean, whatever little comfort that the waiting process may provide, which may be a very small part of it, is all those cases more than 1,500 crores. But there also, once again, it has to be COVID-specific cases and not cases otherwise, basically. So therefore, I would say, yes, I mean, go back to your question, ARCs, yes, I mean, the committee did examine. But finally, we said only in case of severe cases, there can be a role for ARCs. Yeah. Back to you, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much. It is only about severe cases that I had in mind, and there are certain restrictions that even in severe cases, if the cases are recognized early, because even in severe cases, it is kind of early recognition. And, only the banks or only the borrowers are not the ones. So we have to have a collective view on everybody to contribute and not take only one view, not one bullet kills all or one solution to all problems cannot be the right approach. So that is where I was coming from, sir. Sheshadri, should I go ahead with my vote of thanks? Or
yes, please go ahead.
For any more questions?
Before the questions, if I may request everybody to stay on online, because we have the interactive session subsequent to this, where we have a panel and we are going to discuss the one-time restructuring circulars and other aspects associated with it. So kindly do stay online. So please go ahead, Mr. Goel.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, first of all, I'd like to thank ASSOCHAM for organizing such a wonderful brainstorming session, which is just begun. And I can see all the participants who are very wise and from different fields. And I'm sure a lot will come out. And I believe that there is always scope of improvement in what has been done and can always get better and better going forward. It has been it is restructuring is need of the hour. And I special thanks to Seshadri ji, Madam Padmaja, Mr. Ashwin Parekh, Mr. Subhash Garg for giving their wonderful views. So I would say that bullet points which I've been able to collect till now is that it was certainly a Herculean task that the committee achieved to study such a large database in 30 days. Hats off to them. 281 sectors amounting to 80% of restructuring were kind of good and could have done well, while 27 sectors were the one which needed special attention. It was also added that grants of government can be another supportive measure to the ongoing restructuring. While I have also a view that any kind of nation rebuilding has to be a collective effort from everybody, and it is never limited to government policies, banks, industrialists, entrepreneurs, but it is a responsibility of every citizen to come forward and do the bit in the nation building. I thank you everybody for listening to me, and thank you for ASSOCHAM and all the panelists once again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Goel. Very kind of you to give that very crisp vote of thanks. With that, we move to our next agenda item, which is essentially the virtual interaction session, where we have a very distinguished panel of eminent personalities who understand Indian industry as such, as well as the Indian financial space, and who are all part of this. So it's my great honor to moderate this session. We have with us Ms. Vipula Sharma, who is the Director Ratings of Brickwork Ratings India Private Limited. Shri Harkamal Ghuman, the Managing Director of Alvarez and Marshall India. Shri Anil Goel, Founder Chairman of AAA Insolvency Professionals LLP. Shri Jyoti Prakash Gadia, MD Resurgent India Limited. Shri Ankur Srivastav, Managing Partner of EZY Law. Shri George Alexander Muthoot, MD of Muthoot Group. Shri Sachindranath, Executive Chairman of Ugrow Capital. Shri Pradeep Goel, CMD Prudent Asset Reconstruction Company Limited. Shri Arun Saxena, Managing Partner, Saxena and Saxena Advocates. Shri S.C. Agarwal, CMD SMC. Ms. Anju Agarwal, Director, ASC Group. And finally, Mr. Shri Sunil Kumar Manocha, Founder Director, Capital Square Group. So welcome to the panelists. It's wonderful to have you with us. We have, it's one of those strange days where we are ahead of schedule. So, it's not something that normally happens. So I must thank the prior, the speakers in the earlier session for allowing us to get here ahead of time. To get this on the road, I thought the best way to do that was to ask Ms. Sharma, Ms. Vipula Sharma from Brickworks Ratings, what her view of the economic scenario was. I thought that the businesses have been impacted, which are the parts of the business that have been impacted very deeply, and then take the conversation forward as to how we can actually address these issues that the current economic environment is throwing up. Ms. Sharma? Are you there?
I was on mute, so I think you couldn't hear me. Now you can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. So we have seen a lot of companies going through the COVID. Like Mr. Garg mentioned, there is a certain set of companies who have been impacted by COVID itself, and the other set of companies who have been impacted by the COVID lockdown. The COVID lockdown impacted companies are the ones who have been, who would be benefited by this COVID restructuring package, so to say. But while all this is there, one is the NBFCs and the banks, we have also taken a hit on the moratorium. Then now the waiver of the compound interest. And now this restructuring, if implemented, how it would impact their balance sheets and their ALMs would be something that we would have to look at. Second is they haven't been really able to restructure their liabilities in the same way as they would like to. That is one area of it. Second is what we see is all the sectors, whether it's the service sector like the hotels and the tourism and the airlines who have been, and the transportation sector who have been really badly impacted. And there is the other set of sectors who have been impacted due to the lack of demand. So those sectors who have been impacted due to lack of demand, for them to actually establish a timeline by when things will pick up and actually be able to service their loans would be a little difficult. So picking up of demand is something I think which would be required in the first place, and establishing that would be difficult right now, given that we don't know when COVID will really go away, vaccinations will be in place, and things will become normal again. So yes, the real estate space, the commercial space, very badly affected. So I see a lot of people really investing only in the PSU sector for now. In the private sector, there's a lot of uncertainty. There are certain sectors who have been fairly stable. There have been certain sectors who have been impacted very badly. So yes, we're still looking. And now while the demand has picked up to the pre-COVID levels in the current month, we're still looking as to whether this temporary hit, how many of them are able to get out of and able to really come out of this. So that's my opinion for now. I think the panel can give their opinions and then we can take it forward.
Thank you very much. Maybe may I take the opportunity to throwing this open to the panel to understand where are the areas of stress? Are there specific areas, or is this more broad-based? Is economic stress a broad-based phenomenon which requires even greater help than what is currently envisioned? So, with that, let me open this to the panel. Maybe Mr. Nath, if you want to go first. You're on mute, Mr. Nath.
Yeah, I just unmuted. Thanks, Mr. Shishadri, and thanks, ASSOCHAM, for this wonderful session. And it was very it was good to hear the thought of Mr. Parekh and Mr. Garg and everyone. I would focus more on MSMEs, which is my core area of where our company Ugro is focused upon. Within the broader MSME sector, and we have been doing this constant survey of our underlying customer base. Our view is that the impact of COVID on MSME is not uniform impact. So while the guideline for restructuring is a uniform guideline, but because we are largely a sectoral focused NBFC lending to MSME. To give you an example, it is presumed that hospitality is worse affected within the with the pandemic impact because of the lockdown. But what we have seen that within the hospitality itself, we created this mortality rate index, and we found the banquet hall are one whose survival or revival is almost impossible in next 12 to 18 months, versus fast food delivery chains are actually coming back to 70% normalization rate. So on and so forth. In terms of, we have seen that food processing industry is actually doing better than what they were pre-COVID era. Same is what is happening into chemical industry, electrical equipment manufacturing. So it is unless within the broader MSME segment, if you don't treat the customers of different segment differently, eventually you will delay the problem for some period of time, but finally they will hit you. So it is not very easy to just restructure account for a certain period of time, just make one-time provision and the problem would be over. I don't know what is the answer to bring a template structure to provide this relief, but the impact is varies. It varies by sector, varies by subsector, it varies by geography, location, and the type of business you are in.
Thank you, Mr. Nath. I think this is the first time that there is overarching financial distress. There are corporates in distress, there are MSMEs in distress, and there are a situation where everything comes together the way it has come together now. May I request Mr. Muthoot, who deals with, I think, millions of individuals, to understand his views. How deep is this distress? Are there specific areas where there are distress? Is there specific industry types that are impacted? What is your reading, sir?
Thank you, and thank you, ASSOCHAM also. I'm happy to be here. I think I should be the only person from far south Kerala who's participating in this, in the panel. So first of all, I would like to say something about Kerala, then I'll come to our industry also. In Kerala, the main industries or what was leading Kerala was the travel, leisure, hospitality. That has been badly impacted, especially in Kerala also, because first of all, Kerala is not allowing people to come from outside the state. They are insisting on 7 days and 14 days quarantine. So the leisure tourist industry has been severely affected in Kerala. Another, I wouldn't say industry, but the healthcare was also doing very well in Kerala. But it was also affected. Small hospitals have got affected. But the major chains in the hospital or the healthcare are limping back to normalcy now. Now, coming back to Muthoot, where we deal with a large number of customers, yes, the main customers are small traders, small businessmen, etc. They have been affected, certainly. But they are, I think, coming back faster because today people taking gold loans, small loans of 50,000, 1 lakh, etc. They are the small traders and small businessmen. They want to restart their business. That means they are looking at coming back. So those people are definitely coming back and they need money, and that is where we are actually there. So the small traders, etc., to whom we are the we serve the maximum, and they are coming back is what I think. They are certainly coming back. It's a gold loan, please understand, it's not a distress loan taken by people for any hospital need, etc. Those are past days. This is mainly a small productive loan which is given to people without a credit rating, etc. So they bring the gold ornaments and get it. As far as our interest, that's for the Kerala and for our customers. For us, this is actually not really affected us. Our businesses during the lockdown, it was bad because we couldn't open the office. A month of that, after that, branches are now open. People are able to come, of course, with their own transport. And actually, for us, we are back to pre-COVID days. That is the industry for us. But as I said earlier, Kerala has been impacted, especially the tourism and travel, and also the small sectors to whom we are actually financiers today or giving funds today. They are coming back. I think at least somewhere we should see some green shoots. Everybody shouldn't be talking about going down the road, down the drain, etc. There are some things coming in. Small businesses are starting to look up. That's what I feel from our customers. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Muthoot. That is very encouraging to hear that the smaller businesses are coming back. I have one follow-on question. Effectively, when people pledge gold and they are using this to run their own small business, effectively you are providers of capital. I mean, even though it is a loan, in the customer's mind, it is his own equity that is going into the business. To restructure their facilities, or are they able to make their repayment obligations to you? I mean, what is the current position?
Yeah. So I think there is something which is to be understood also. Gold loans are all bullet payment loans. There are no EMIs for a gold loan. That is why people take a gold loan. So it is given for 12 months and you can repay it at any point of time. There are no EMIs. There are no compulsions to pay interest also. It's all optional. Of course, if they pay interest monthly in service, they get an interest concession. Otherwise, there is no obligation. There is no request from our side for them to pay EMI or interest. But then the average tenure actually works out to only 4 to 5 months. So they have actually getting equity on their loan. And as you put it, it is actually, we are monetizing the idle gold ornaments which they are lying. We take only ornaments. So the old ornaments which are there, actually we monetize them. And as you said, one more thing, actually we are not giving a loan. we are taking a deposit of gold ornaments. We are getting 100 rupees or 150 rupees worth of gold and giving him back only 75 rupees. So actually, he is a depositor. We are not giving a loan actually. He is depositing his gold, and on that we are giving a loan. So to answer your question rightly, there are no EMIs. So that in that sense, it's a very comfortable and very easy loan for them. It is quite customer friendly in that sense.
Thank you, Mr. Muthoot. So clearly, the individuals as such who are borrowing seem to be adjusting to the post-COVID reality. So I don't know if there is anybody here who is, running a bank who have large retail exposures for us to understand whether significant restructuring of retail books. So we'll park that to one side, and we will go into the MSME side as well as on the corporate exposures. And for a brief while, with everybody's permission, we'd like to focus on the corporate exposure and understand, how the environment is behaving, what the issues are, and more importantly, what are the issues with the current circulars of the RBI. One of the points that has been brought up to me by others is that, look, it could have been more principle based, because if the intent of the regulator were to save all businesses that are viable as of this moment, having so many rules around it may make it very difficult for us to have that achieved. Under the circumstances, that's the policy of the country today. So let me request Mr. Ghuman, who is the managing director of Alvarez and Marshall, to give us his view. Where is he seeing the stress? What is his take of the current policy, etc.?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Shadri, and thanks to ASSOCHAM for providing us this platform. I think, when, and we broadly focus on the corporates only, so I'll give you the viewpoint on the corporates. I think when we started analyzing the impact of COVID, which is, like a black swan event for the Indian economy, and perhaps one of the only ones in the recent times, we thought that, maybe, there could be there could be categorization of the companies, and we can make the cases for each of those categorizations going forward and in analyzing the impact of COVID. So I think what we did was we thought that, we can probably classify the companies into 4 categories. The first one were the ones where the business models were already a little bit crumbling, the cash flows were under stress, and that was happening, prior to COVID itself as well. And there, I think, there was, a surgical restructuring was the need of the hour, which should have been done even before the COVID and even before the restructuring which came into play because of the COVID. The second were the ones, where the business model got impacted, because of the lockdown. But I think, even though they were pulled down by the virus effect, they just kind of got up, dusted themselves, and then the things moved on. And I think those are the people, or those are the corporates who are currently again, going back to the pre-COVID levels in terms of the business activities, or some are even enhancing. The third, I would say, were the basket cases. There wasn't any viability earlier. There is no viability now, and I probably feel that they may be the one who may go into insolvency or liquidation as and when that window is open again. And finally, I think the fourth one is some of the companies which actually benefited out of it. For example, the work from home became a new norm. Then you had all the supply chain companies where there was a lot of online ordering, there was a lot of logistics related issues which got cropped up. The unorganized market from the logistics sectors kind of totally went out. So so there are those pockets also which kind of benefited very, very positively because of the COVID as well. I think going forward, we are going to see a lot of fundamental shifts in various industries. There is going to be zero-sum game played in some sectors where the consolidation is going to happen. There is going to be some business models which are going to fundamentally change. There is going to be behavioral changes in terms of how we staff people, how we treat them, and how we kind of get the productivity levels up again. And I think on a broader level, it is making our economy a little bit more resilient, because having been through this sort of a experience, and still we don't know where the end game is. But I think people have started formulating plan B or plan C, so that they can survive something similar if it comes in the future. So with this, I would like my fellow panelists to also probably add their views onto this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Guman. Any other comments from anybody else in addition to what Mr. Guman was saying?
Here, K.K. Gupta representing Resurgent India. Sir, Shadi sir, I can speak? Hello. So, sir, my view.
Please go ahead, Mr. Gupta. Please go.
Yes, please. I can speak, sir. Good afternoon, friends.
Go ahead, sir. Please go ahead. Please go ahead. Please go ahead.
K.K. Gupta representing Resurgent India. We are a financial company, sir. Once you are talking to the entrepreneur, it is fine that people are not coming for a restructuring, because it envisages that 5 to 8% of the total will go for infrastructure for the restructuring. As Mr. Agarwal also told that about 22 lakh crore rupees are stuck up in the COVID under stress assets. After stress assets, after the, you can say, 1st March, about 60 lakhs crore rupees is also stuck up. That means totally 38 lakhs crore rupees is there. Government has come out a scheme as a per RBI one-time restructuring, at which Shadri and Madam has explained very well. So besides that, why the people are not coming? When we are talking to the entrepreneur, it is fine that they are anticipating that their rating model will go down. If the rating is coming down, the rate of interest will also increase. Second issue, what they are referring, when they are going for a fresh credit facilities, so bank may hesitant to give them because their account was restructured. I think these are the two apprehensions in the mind of the entrepreneurs. Now I feel that Mrs. Sharma is with us for a rating agencies. How she feel that rating of the borrower who is going for infrastructure or restructuring can be decreased. This is one issue. Another banker point of view, what I feel that there should not be any effect regarding providing any fresh term loan or something like that. I think these are the two apprehensions in the mind. Otherwise, scheme is a well designed and well explained. You can have extension for the 2-year period. Some restructuring can be done. Even some debt can be converted into equity. All schemes, I think, everybody known to these days. Lekin for the customer, for the entrepreneur who are listening, why they are not coming? This is a major aspect. I have also seen one statement of chairman of the State Bank of India recently. They are also telling the people are hesitant to have a restructuring proposal. I think this is the main issue which we can discuss. With this word, I will come when we will interact it. Lekin these are the two issues what I feel that should be deliberate. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gupta. That was a very interesting observation that you made, that the RBI has given a framework within which you can restructure, but the entrepreneurs are not willing to get themselves restructured. Why entrepreneurs?
Regarding rating, there are two things which we have been told by the regulators. One is that if it is specific to COVID and it's a temporary thing, it should not be downgraded as quickly as what you would in other cases. But at the same time, if there is a restructuring, we would look at how the liquidity has been impacted and take some rating action accordingly. But the second aspect of it is now under COVID, when we are upgrading the rating for any this, normally what we would do is if it goes into default, we would require a cooling period, go into non-investment grade, then go to investment grade, and that's how we would upgrade an asset. But now, under COVID, we have been told that we can upgrade if we feel that the company has recovered and the liquidity aspects have been addressed and the company has come back. So that period by which it would get upgraded becomes shorter in this case. So to that extent, I think the temporary restructuring which we're talking of today, in terms of the one-time restructuring which the RBI has proposed, that would not impact it on the long term. Yes, in the temporary liquidity, some level of mismatch, some level of impact would be there because we have to take it into cognizance. But on the whole, within a year or two, things should recover and the entrepreneurs should come back to what they were earlier. It will be faster. That's all I can say.
Let me also add something, sorry, Shadi, let me add, and try to answer the second question asked by Mr. Gupta. I think, entrepreneurs are right in terms of their hesitation. And the reason is, even though the people have short memories, we have seen what has happened to all the people, all the promoters who have gone for the restructuring in the recent past. Since there wasn't a consensus between the promoters or the shareholders and the banks, this kept on dragging, and at some point of time, somebody will file, let's say an insolvency application, and the promoter was kind of, on the verge of, or in some cases also lost their companies. And I think that's what is causing the hesitation. I think the regulator has been mindful of this aspect, and they tried to, at least in this OTR scheme, they have tried to address that. And what they have done is they have given a rule book to the banks that here are the financial parameters which are which have overarching effect on all the sectors, and then there are also sectors, and then these are the timelines and these are the benefits that you need to kind of you can read why you do the restructuring like this. So I think since there is a trust deficit on both the sides, the regulator has tried to bridge that. But I'm with you. I think the proof of the pudding is in the eating. We need to have a couple of successful cases getting done really fast to kind of make sure that both parties have the confidence that this restructuring can be undertaken and this restructuring can be implemented. And I think only after that, we will see more people coming and trying to address their problems of over leverage, trying to address the problem of their business getting impacted because of COVID, before we will have a wide scale adoption of this mechanism.
Thank you, Mr. Kuman. The point that I am a little surprised about is that, look, the entrepreneur is running a business and the business is in trouble. And it's it's not having enough money to meet its working capital requirements, or it doesn't have the money to finish a project that it has started. He or she more capital is available from somewhere. I understand that there's a trust deficit that has developed between bankers and entrepreneurs. That's where the trust deficit has been, because of the elevated levels of corporate losses that have been there over the last 2 or 3 years. But under the current circumstances, what is the alternative? Maybe Mr. Guman, you can tell us why. I mean, in the entrepreneur's mind, what is the alternative but to restructure? So I don't know if my question was put poorly, but let me ask Mr. Ankush Srivastav, who is the managing partner of EZY Laws. From perhaps some of them are in good shape, others are finding it difficult under COVID. What alternatives are they seeing for themselves as to how are they going to manage this situation?
Thank you. It's a good question. What the clients which are into as a lawyer, as a RP, the clients are little apprehensive about what is the restructuring, and they didn't even know what are the terms, how it will shape up. Because when they go to the banks, lot of time it happens, there are upfront payments demand. which they are not able to meet. This one-time structuring scheme, this is a very good program because it is now for the last couple of months. But still, when we go into the market, talk to the promoters or things, a lot of things are not clear to them. Most of them have the problem, and they were already under the stress before the lockdown also. And when it's limited it to the 1st March, so they say this is the amount which we have to pay, how we are going to portray. Suppose this is a 2 years period which has been given under this one year structuring things. So suppose the business will not pick up, like I take the case in the Mumbai, lot of industries, lot of workers has migrated, the factories are still not started, and they don't see that they will come back to the same cash flow maybe next 6 months to 1 year. And though it is a good thing that they want to restructure everything, but the problem is how to do the cash flow management. And this is the biggest problem which is happening. The other thing, as I said, that people are not very much clear about what are the this one-time structuring, maybe a little more publicity or little more counseling to the borrowers, which is the required thing at this point of time.
Thank you, Mr. Srivastav. I noticed Mr. Goel was wanting to say something. Mr. Goel, please go ahead. Mr. Anil Goel.
Thank you, Mr. Sheshadri, and thank you, ASSOCHAM, for giving me this opportunity. So I've heard all the speakers, and it was a wonderful discussion today. I simply see because of my experience in restructuring and insolvency, I'm trying to say that like there are three kind of businesses that we would actually have it in the market. One is that they were not doing well before, and they were NPA, so that this particular RBI scheme is not applicable to them. And the second, which is who are deep into trouble because of the lockdown and COVID scenario. When we see this entire scheme, to my understanding, even this scheme is not also very, very useful for them who are deep into trouble because of the following reasons. Number one reason is that this total one, that there is no waiver of principal amount, which is provided in this scheme. So if somebody is deep into trouble, it would be very difficult for him to come out only simply because of the restructuring, some kind of discount in the interest, some kind of repayment of the tenure period getting extended by 2 years. And those people, they will depend upon the projections that they would make. And I understand that there are businesses where they would project continuous losses for the next 2 years as well because of the revenues coming down, and the revenue will remain down for the next 2 years or 1.5 years, or even maybe more. So I think that actually while reading this scheme carefully, I'm not even sure that whether this scheme will be helpful to them as well, because the benefits offered under this scheme may not be very, very useful for them because they actually have gone very, very down into the businesses, and they may continue to go down into the businesses. However, there is a middle segment, and that middle segment is that the businesses which were doing well and they had some temporary setback, and they can get back to their normalcy by invoking the framework of this scheme by asking for some kind of interest rebate or repayment of interest in some installments. Also, extending the timeline in 2 years, and because their business might even take a U-turn after the lockdown or after the COVID impact, and they may be able to service the debt and restructure debt. So what is that segment? What is the percentage of that segment which actually will get benefited out of this framework of scheme? Is a very, very small percentage. So this is one observation that I have. And the second observation that I have, because of my experience, whenever somebody goes to the banks with their projections of the losses or whatever the losses are going to be in the next some period, the banks would also take a decision based on the underlying security, based on the track record of the promoters, and based on the contribution made by the promoters in this restructuring plan, which some people may or some people may not be able to do that. So that is also a very, very important aspect, but this is not mandatory for the banks to accept a resolution plan. And the resolution plan may it be a very, very genuine resolution plan, but the bank may again look at the underlying value of the security, and also the track record, and also the net worth of the associate concerns. So all these issues, again, the benefit will come down to those people who are actually doing well and they have suffered some temporary losses. Some comment on the other part, which since we do insolvency a lot, we were apprehensive about those people when this insolvency was banned for all those defaults post 25th of March 2020. It was an apprehension that what will happen to these kind of units, which we are talking about today. So that way, this RBI framework of the scheme of one-time restructuring is very, very useful. Anyone who is not able to go for insolvency, they can definitely avail the benefits of this scheme. The only motivation to the banks that I could see in this is that any inertia from the bank's side will lead to higher provisioning. So they would probably take faster action, and they would not like their balance sheet to be further deteriorated by higher provisioning. As against 10%, they will have to a 20% provisioning immediately after the expiry of the period of invocation. And later on, they would also provide for the higher provisioning based on the IRAC norms. The one segment which is very, very pleasantly impacted with this RBI framework of scheme is the personal segment, because since we deal with a lot of home buyers who have taken loans from their banks and the real estate companies not delivering and they are paying installments. So they keep asking us that in case we don't pay on us. So the information to you with the credit information companies as certified by RBI, like CIBIL, or there are other companies. There are 5 such companies which are authorized by RBI for giving credit information. Those companies would have some, they would track your default, and you would not be able to even use your credit card. You would not be able to take even a fresh card loan. However, if the default is occurring because of the COVID, and it is the default which is post-COVID, this may not impact, because once a person applies for the restructuring, invoke the resolution plan, implement the resolution plans, his account would be considered as standard, and he would not be considered as a defaulter. His credit rating would not be spoiled. He would still be able to go ahead and take a credit card, take a low car loan, take a fresh home loan. So that's a very, very pleasant impact, of the scheme. So for the time being, these are my observations, and I'll come again, like if it is, if I'm invited. Thank you, Mr. Shishadri. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Mr. Goel. Couple of observations. You said that if an individual were to take recourse to the restructuring I think that his credit score will still get impacted. I don't think the credit bureau's scoring system will leave the score where it is. So to that extent, there will be an impact on the individual. And it is going to be very, very difficult. I mean, any business that is asking for restructuring from the bank's perspective is a weak business. And I think as I'm speaking as a banker, the individuals who are entrepreneurs should be aware of the fact that banks will be looking at them slightly negatively. But if their business becomes okay, there is no need for them to continue to be of that mindset. So I think, as you rightly said, under the current circumstances, banks also have an inclination to do this, because it will come from the account becoming a non-performing account. One point, perhaps Ms. Sharma can talk to us. I mean, I think there's a lot of discussion in the press, and in fact, even the RBI said that this time the restructuring is going to be different from the last time, and therefore they've put more guardrails to ensure that the restructuring leads to outcomes which are better than the restructuring that happened during the global financial crisis. Maybe Ms. Sharma can tell us a little bit about what happened during the global financial crisis and why RBI is saying what it is saying right now. You're on mute. You're on mute.
Yeah. In this case, I think this restructuring is focused on COVID impacted sectors which have temporary liquidity problems, like most of the panelists pointed out. So this kind of when every guardrail is established, bankers, I think, are more amenable to doing a restructuring within those guidelines as against having a more, discretionary approach to it. So therefore, I think the expectation is that, but I don't see a lot of people also going for the restructuring because of whatever reasons have been enumerated by all of them. And also the timelines. The bankers are finding it difficult to meet those timelines for those set of. See, one is that the assets have been restricted to those which are standard as on 31st March 20. Now, when you say 31st March 20, standard as on 31st March 20, like Mrs. Padmaja pointed out, there were a lot of assets which were impacted even due to the international lockdowns, COVID, reducing exports, reducing a lot of other things were happening. So there were companies that were impacted even before that. So those have been out of this ambit. And second was that this is a very focused thing for sectors and very defined. So that is the expectation that the restructuring will be faster and more possible from the, if the bankers want to do it, it is easier for them to say, yes, these are the assets that we'll go for restructuring. So that is the expectation, but going by whatever the downgrades and the asset deterioration is only getting slowed down. So we really don't know what will happen unless we see some cases which are really going through the restructuring and finally come out of it once the demand also picks up.
Hello. Hello. Sir, I am KK Gupta here. So my submission, as on 7th June 19 circular, the account will not be upgraded. It is remain as substandard assets. For this scheme, I think this is better. The account will be remain as a standard and bank has to make a provision only 10%. That is the first beauty of this circular is. Amount, other thing is 2-year time is sufficient and they can restructure the account, even FTL they can create it, and also reschedule on the installment they can also do it. I think this is the major aspect for the more important aspect is RP4. In the circular of 7 June 19, it is mandatory that the rating agency should evaluate the scheme and should have a RP4. That means it is a investment grade. Now there is no such condition in this scheme. Only you have to evaluate by the rating agency. Now only rating agency at this stage they can tell us, because they are talking that they're still talking with the RBI people, whether they will give a RP4 rating or investment grade rating, or otherwise they can say the unit is viable, accordingly bank can restructure it. Because 100 crore and above, viability is the most important aspect which have to evaluate by the rating agencies. And there was a 2 agency for 500 crore and above in the 19th circular. Now it is only 1 rating agency. He has to see that. That is most important aspect, and this scheme is better than the scheme of, you can say, June 19. I feel that this scheme is much better. You can restructure the account, you can create a FTL, you can postpone the installments. Same thing you can do it without degrading the account as a substandard assets. It will remain a standard asset. What I feel like that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gupta. What you're basically saying is that the provisions under the new policy are a little easier than the old policy. It continues to keep the account as a standard account as opposed to a substandard account in the past. Provisioning requirements are lower than in the past. But having customers to actually engage with customers to restructure, because otherwise their balance sheets are going to be impacted. One element where there's a lot of
major aspect what I feel it financial ratios, because the Kamath committee has suggested 5 financial ratios. Now it is not very clear in the mind of the entrepreneur that this ratio will apply immediately as on the March 20 balance sheet. Again, I feel that it should be applied only in March 22. March 22, they must achieve the ratio. Another important aspect is net tangible worth. After adjustment of the investment, other thing, then you have to see the net tangible worth. Lekin bank will hesitate to convert that into equity, because once they transfer into equity, they will have to provide 100% provision. That means it is very difficult that can be transferred into equity. And without equity, you cannot maintain the ratios in certain industry. You cannot maintain the ratio even after 22. That was the, I think, major aspect in the banking that we have to explain very clearly to the entrepreneur while preparing a resolution plan. You have to project the cash flow accordingly. Your DSCR should be there. Your current ratio should be there. Your net tangible worth should also be there. So everything we have to spell out. These 5 ratios are most important ratio in the economic committee which they have recommended. I think this is also fair in the mind of the entrepreneurs.
So my understanding is that those ratios have to be met a priori. I think it has to happen. The adjusted tangible net worth has to be it is a reasonable going concern before you go into restructuring. I don't know whether I can. It is an outcome that they are looking at post the restructuring. But having said that, I understand what you're saying. You're saying that these 5 ratios may pose a little bit of difficulty with respect to the restructuring. Specifically, I noticed that things like ASCR and all have been set at reasonably high levels. These are not at very low levels. Interest coverage ratios are also higher. Debt to EBITDA numbers are also reasonable numbers, and I don't know how many of our borrowers will actually. But that's the point that you're making, Mr. Gupta. And,
Yes,
thank you very much.
To my understanding, Mr. Sheshadri, Mr. Sheshadri, I think what Mr. Gupta is saying, that as I said, I think it reinforcing my point of view that this framework of scheme would be utilized only by a few parties and who actually had a good balance sheet, and they suffered temporarily because of the lockdown and because of the COVID. And those parties who had actually these good financial ratios and temporarily they would like to take the benefit of some interest rate concessions, and that is the most utilized portion of this framework would be. As far as 7th June 2019 as RBI scheme is concerned, that is actually targeting a different set of borrowers who actually were in default much before, whereas this particular framework is only targeting giving a remedy to those who were not NPA as on 1st of March 2020. So this particular scheme is primarily focused on only few parties who are suffering temporarily and nothing like continuous COVID impact on them. Wherever any industry is having continuous impact of the COVID, it will be very difficult for them to prove those ratios with the bank. What I understand is by all this, we can also kind of represent before the banks that when they frame board approved policies, they should make provisions for all these things which are in their power when they actually approve a resolution plan and when they approve an invocation of framework of this scheme. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Goel. I think the point that you're trying to make is that it is of this there must be limited utility of this plan, and I think what you're trying to say, and I don't want to put words in your mouth. Perhaps what you're trying to articulate is the need for a principle-based approach as opposed to a rules-based approach, which has been taken in this case. May I turn to Ms. Agarwal, Ms. Anju Agarwal, for her.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Sheshadri, and thank you, ASSOCHAM, for putting this panel together and wonderful discussion till now. I would not like to talk about obviously the scheme which is there. I think we all talked about already a lot about that, what is there in the scheme. I would like to talk about from the perspective of economics and the economy at large. In the sense, I will tell what I'm trying to say here is this: that one, the every segment of the economy, whether it is banking, businesses like corporates or individuals, everybody, they are part of a one single economy. And when we talk about now, the economy is not only a national economy, it is a global economy. We all understand that, right? So my perspective is from when there is a stress in the economy, and which is not for any particular reason in particular, like the sector wise or anything. It is because of a pandemic which is widespread, which is global, and everybody is affected by that. So how this restructuring should work, obviously I may sound a little bit innovative or naive when I talk about, but I would like you still to hear what I'm trying to say. So what this restructuring offers, to my understanding, is only deferment of payments, which I think Mr. Goyal touched upon a very clear view that there is no interest waiver, there is no cut in the principal, and a little bit from the perspective Mr. Nath talked about, that not all the industries suffered from the stress. So there are few industries who actually suffered very severely from COVID itself. And in fact, as Mr. Garg has also talked about, that we are here talking about specifically the stress which has been due to COVID-19. So we are only dealing, because in any case, we are dealing with the accounts which are standard by 31st March, right? So what I'm trying to put in here is, when there is a limited safer resources, we have to do some kind of a redistribution of that. So when I'm saying that, is like there are few industries which were actually impacted very badly, and we all know that it was not because whether they were in stress earlier or it was some intentional thing. It is very, very clear, like hospitality, aviation, we all talked about. It is a very evident thing that they were impacted because of COVID-19 only. So to at least where we kind of recognize that these were the only COVID-19 impact, why can't banks think of giving, only for, say, for example, 6 months or 9 months where the moratorium was given, at least some waiver on interest, or some percentage of, depending on what is the severity of the impact of COVID-19, some cut on for those installments only, some principal amount. Now banks would obviously ask, because they would now be put to the systemic risk, from where they would get the money. They will get, see, it is again, it's just my thought process. And I will, so first I'll give you the perspective from where I'm coming. We are a consulting company, and we work through 8 service verticals, right? So there were few verticals of our company which were very badly impacted by this COVID-19. I can easily say that insolvency and bankruptcy vertical, or the legal services vertical, was impacted very badly. But there was another vertical which was providing services to the product testing, like we also do practice into legal metrology and BIS certification. So all the thermometers, all the, I would say, PPE kits, all the sterilizers, or all those products which were coming, which were getting tested. So that vertical was doing very good business in the COVID-19, right? The time when the stress was going on. Same for some verticals like GST or some other verticals. They were also doing good because they were the retainership businesses and not much affected by that. So how we, save through this COVID-19 situation is that 300 people were given the salaries regularly because of the reason some verticals were still bringing in cash, and some verticals, even if they were, cash dry, still we could somehow manage, and we always gave our salaries on time. All our expenses were done. So when I'm saying this, so there are few businesses we all are recognizing somewhere or the other, everybody touched upon, like IT services, like pharma, generic medicines I'm talking about, like food, like Ayurveda, Zoom, we all know, like the kind of business Zoom has done. Netflix, for that matter. People were at home. There was no other entertainment methods. Amazon Prime, or all these, web link. So these are the industries which did better. So that is one perspective. Like maybe some part of, you can call it a corona cess or something like that. Maybe if we can put on these industries who did really well during the corona time, some kind of redistribution, so we can bring in money from there and, give some discounts to people who have really been affected by this only, because we have to in any case sail through, and it is a one economy. We have to work around. All the sectors should work in sync with. Secondly is that employees got salary cuts, right? Landowners or property owners took cut on their rents, right? So there were so many. So I don't think even if on the FDs or depositors' money which are lying in the savings bank, if banks could little bit, say 1% or 0.5%, would reduce the interest on them, I don't think people would mind at all. We have seen that how people have collectively worked, to come out of this stress, and they have done so many things. Like we have, even if our part-time maids were not coming at home, we were still saying their salaries, right? Because so that we wanted to handhold people who could not otherwise, survive in this condition. So we still, the peons or the, lower strata of labor who were, So this was the idea. So I was just thinking if we can, do little bit of redistribution of money, and somewhere, we can handle those people who were really stressed, and somewhere we can take some from who did well. And that's how we can, sail through, because obviously banks has to also survive. If we do not take that decision now, in any case, those accounts which got stressed because of this COVID-19, ultimately will fall into NP and fall into insolvency and things like that. And after 2 years or 3 years, bank again would be, getting struggle to bring them on track or, make them standard. So it is not going to happen. Opportunity has already been there.
Essentially, what you're essentially saying, ma'am, is that we must recognize that the areas where there is deep intrinsic stress, and where there are other areas where they've become unintended beneficiaries of this crisis.
Yes.
And you're trying to impose a tax on one so that you cross-subsidize the other. I think that is outside the ken of this conversation. That is outside the ambit or scope of today's conversation. It's a very good idea.
Yeah.
As we did more to how
so,
the political masters
as a business body or a corporate body can put this to government maybe, or the banking associations where it can be put. So some way we have to. See, if we brush it up under the carpet again, it is going to come back in a larger size, in a larger impact.
There are other ways of doing it. Ultimately, I think we all agree that society has to take the price for this. All of us have to pay the price. You cannot force a bank to pay or a depositor to pay. So somehow society has to pay it. One way of doing this is to say RBI opens a rediscount window where loans that are being restructured can be financed through the rediscount window, which is at a discounted rate. So, and RBI can say, if you're going to access my rediscount window, you can the cost of borrowing for those entities that are being, restructured. So, and that does not impose a cost on anybody other than to society as at large. There is no particular individual who is suffering from it. These kind of suggestions have already been made to us, and we are awaiting their outcome. So if I may bring the conversation back to NBFCs, there were people in the beginning who were talking about how NBFCs have suffered from an asymmetric movement, in the sense that their loans are not getting restructured, but they are being forced to restructure their customers' loans. So if I may ask Mr. Nath what his view is today, how is the liquidity for the NBFCs? Have the structural solutions that have been provided working?
Thanks, Mr. Seshadri, and can you hear me? Hello,
Yes, we
can you
can.
hear me? Okay. No, as you very rightly said that I think so NBFC, which are also corporate, fall in the cracks somewhere. We saw that happening at the time of the moratorium, wherein when the moratorium circular came, NBFCs were expected to provide moratorium to their customers, but banks were unwilling to provide moratorium to NBFC because NBFC were not treated like a normal corporate. And I think so that the same is getting, and obviously that created liquidity crisis, which got averted by, multiple lines of liquidity which government provided in form of, partial credit guarantee scheme, TLTRO, which to some extent avoided the accident in the short tenor, right? But, so it provided liquidity for next 18 months or so. What is happening in the second phase? Again, if you look at the, restructuring circular, the financial institution loan, which is loans from banks to NBFCs, cannot be treated at par with a corporate loan because the business of an NBFC or an HFC is to borrow from a bank and lend to a borrower. And if there is a stress on underlying borrower segment, and NBFC has to restructure, and which means that its own cash flow would get affected by those restructuring. And if they go back to banks and they have to follow the current restructuring circular, by the time that would happen, the NBFC would either be in default or they will create a serious problem. So to my mind, the RBI has to provide a separate window of a very simple solution of, providing restructuring of loan for NBFC and HFC as a sector. And it could be as simple as that, wherein there is an NBFC which provides certification that what is the amount of underlying customer loan it has restructured, how much of, cash flow mismatch has occurred because of that. And every bank have the flexibility to match the tenor without going into this whole rigmarole of the restructuring circular and so on and so forth. Because if we don't do this today, we will see another wave in next 12 months of a massive amount of cash flow mismatches, and second, also the growth capital not being available to NBFCs to provide additional support of fresh credit to the underlying segment of the borrowers, especially the small borrowers, MSME, gold loans, two-wheeler finance, auto finance, so on and so forth. You're on mute. Sir, you are on mute.
Can you hear me now, sir?
Oh, I'm so sorry. My apologies. No, I was wondering whether Mr. Muthoot would like to add something to this, to what you just said.
Yeah, but of course, we don't, we have not asked, our company has not asked for any moratorium, etc., from the lenders. But what I feel is that even if you give moratorium, it is not going to be very effective. But restructuring is what is really required. And that restructuring, we should not limit it to 12 months, 6 months, etc. It should be given as what should we say, as a longer period as possible. We do it so that people are able to pay back their installments or EMIs much easier, much conveniently. If the present EMI is X, the future EMI after COVID and after restructuring should be X by 2 or X by 3 only. Something like that, so that they get more time. It is time that can restart these businesses. But if the business gets killed to start something fresh for the country in that sector will be much more expensive. It is better to try to revive these by giving them more time. And the banks, NPA recognition or all those things should be list so that even if a bank or an institution gives extra time to the borrower by giving more and more time instead of 12 months, 18 months, 24 months, 36 months, they should not be penalized but with bad quality loans. They should be same standard itself. So people get more time to start their business. It's not easy to start a new business. It will be very easy to kill a business by asking them to look after them as getting back their money and asking them to wind down their business, he will go, he will stop his business and go. But everybody is affected.
Yes.
We did something like that in India during the real estate crisis. Whereas in US, when 3 months people did not pay up the EMI for their housing loan, they started repossessing all these properties and then started selling. When all these properties got repossessed and started to sell, the real estate market itself fell. But at that time, India didn't do that. We gave more time to the borrowers. Actually, we escaped that problem at that time. Whereas US, etc., had that problem because they are a big economy, rich economy, they could survive that. But India, we actually did not go after the borrowers because of the default. We gave them a little more time for the loans, and that is what I am saying. Give more time to the borrowers. Give very, very long rope, more flexibility to the borrower to pay his installment rather than crush him with a big EMI which he is not able to pay. That is what I
Yeah. I would. Sorry,
Mr. Muthoot.
I would
Go
just,
ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would just like to add very quickly. We saw in the case of moratorium, the lowest proportion of moratorium was offered by NBFC because they didn't had the back-end moratorium from the banks. Same way, we will see that in emergency credit line, the lowest contribution vis-a-vis the outstanding loan is from NBFC. It is just around 7% because there is no liquidity which is available against the emergency credit line. So a loan given by a bank to an NBFC to finance emergency credit line is not covered under the guarantee scheme, and that's why that there is no liquidity. And third, while there is a deserving set of the borrower which would be there under NBFC, they would be forced either not to restructure, or if they will restructure, there will be an asset liability mismatch which get created because the banks would not restructure very easily. And even if they would like to do it, they have to go under current circular, which is not palatable to a financial institution.
So if I may rephrase, we need to intercede with the RBI to make it available NBFCs. A similar restructuring proposition RBI has made available to industrial entities or service entities. I think you and the RBI. A discounted financing window through which the restructuring can actually take place, and both NBFCs and banks should be able to financing. So RBI gives us money at 2% or 3%, 3 or 5 or whatever, and RBI says that you can only add on another. They can lend money to distressed companies at 6%. And I say that this you're accessing through this window does not qualify, sell, or not for CRR kind of requirements. Will be born in society at large, but it will make money available at a cheap rate. If you support this, then perhaps we can request ASSOCHAM to actually make a recommendation of this nature. May I, with that, I'll throw this open to the entire floor and ask for your views.
Yeah. So, Mrs. Seshadri, I'll go first. I think so. This is a fabulous idea because I think so. They would provide incentive. I think so. Look, what I've seen at least in the pandemic state, that only incentive structure, and we saw that in TLTRO as well, is not motivating banks to take credit risk, right? So they would like somebody to also take some form of a credit enhancement or share the first part of the risk itself. So I think so that's the point number one. But even if you create a rediscounting window, simultaneous to that, if you can provide a system wherein some part of that risk is shared, and then you provide a discounted rate so that the cost of the borrower, restructured borrower, goes down. Second is, I think so in all of these restructuring, especially the set of the borrowers who are deeply impacted, there is a portion of debt which need to be either converted into equity, or there is a fresh infusion of equity required. So if RBI for a period of time can provide dispensation that if a bank which is converting debt into equity or infusing on its own certain portion of equity into that business, and that equity is not taken off from its capital adequacy calculation for a period of time, that would also facilitate and help the restructuring process much faster.
I just want to, Mr. Shadri, this is a very good idea, but I think the government was already thinking of setting up a bad money bank, and they've also set up some sort of a private equity fund AIF, where for the stress assets things. So those two things, I think government is already working on that. So that the stress asset companies where the restructuring is required, they can be provided funds. And I think Mr. Anil Goyalji will also agree with me. When we were doing the insolvency cases under the IBC, this is one of the problem. There are too many companies, and there are good companies also, but the funds requirement for them for the resolution applicants, there are very few. So there is always a demand for creating an alternate market where the stress assets.
I think that's a good
I
point.
think
A
Mr.
bank
Ankur,
takes time to get set up.
I think what Mr. Ankur is
May
saying
I
is correct.
go
Doing
ahead, Mr.
as I think it was rightly pointed out by Madam Babda Kundru and Mr. Garg, that there has to be a market for stressed assets, and we all have to work on how to develop the market for these stressed assets. So one of the very important ingredient which is required for developing this market for this stressed asset is easy availability of the loan for taking over a company which is under stress. That's missing in the market as of now. We are working in the surface space, and we are working in the insolvency space, and also in this RBI because where we can change the management. But however, in all these three scenarios, the only limitation that we find is the market place, because there is no market available for the stress assets, because the funding is not available, the credit is not available for the new breed of investors who are ready to work hard, ready to work ethically, but then they need funding for this. So the idea of a bad bank loan, I'm not sure how that idea would actually be a remedy to this difficulty, but this difficulty is actually a very large difficulty to provide a remedy to stressed assets. We have a system of resolution plan under the IBC. We have a resolution plan under the RBI circular. We have the provisions of change of management under SARFAESI also. But under all these three, the only limitation is that the new breed of investors, they are not getting funding. So whenever we publicize a expression of interest, out of the 10 expression of interest that we get, or 10 inquiries we get, out of those 6 or 7, they ask, if the funding is available, we are interested. But if the funding is not available, how can we arrange the funds? So I think at this forum of ASSOCHAM, we can definitely make it a point that this can be represented to the government, that the funding has to be made available so that the market for stressed asset gets developed.
Thank you, Mr. Goyal. That's a good point. But I'm not entirely surprised. I mean, given how these assets have actually played out and who has borne the cost so far, the cost of very poor performing assets have been borne by banks. And you're asking banks to make funding available again for the same asset under similar environmental circumstances. I think you're asking too much from banks at this point in time. What I was suggesting was a discounted window that enables restructuring to happen. Can actually remain.
So, Mr. Shadri, we are only talking about those businesses where there is a positive EBITDA level and the company is available now at serviceable debt. So the out of the 10, I think the 7 companies are bad only because of their higher debt, because of their past losses, because of some incidents or because of some accidents. But now what we are talking about is under IBC or under even RBI circular, we are talking about taking over a company which is EBITDA positive and the EBITDA is sufficient to service the proposed debt, which is a resolved debt. So in case this, see, like when the bank finance a new company, when they finance a new project, their primary the decision making lies on the debt service coverage ratio. So if the debt service coverage ratio is brought to that acceptable norms and the EBITDA positive is already established because the company is running for the last several years, I think this is the best course of, but this is the best option available for the banks to fund because hardly there is any risk because of the EBITDA positive has already been established.
So, Mr. Goel, I understand the point that you're making. I would urge you to look at it from the banker's point of view and look at the banker's balance sheet and the risk, the pains they have taken over the so many years. All those companies they lent to were also EBITDA positive at the point in time that they made those loans. So, having said that, let us now turn to some of the other participants to speak so far. May I request Mr. Sunil Manocha, if he's there, to give us his views?
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much, Mr. Shadri, as well as Association for doing this. I would like to put the things in a different way. Like we need to understand that how this one-time restructuring is different from the earlier restructurings, and apart from that, why it is so, and what made it RBI to make it a general one-time restructurings like this across the sectors. Basically, the genesis itself is different altogether, because the situation is entirely different. We are going through the unprecedented situations, which actually called for the unprecedented. 7-8 months here has tried to actually smoothen the situations and brought in various steps. Initially, they came out with the all of a sudden it happened and everything was put to the lockdown completely. Some kind of solace to the industry. Okay, let us give the moratorium for the 3. Then another 3 months moratorium was given. And on various platforms, I also spoke what will be after 31st of August 2020. So the government definitely should think of, and because cash flows almost stopped, the impact is too huge. In fact, there are a couple of companies which stress was already there, but a couple of companies were actually coming out of the stress, but COVID brought in the revival impact also. Most of the companies which were on the verge of revival actually got affected badly because of this complete lockdown. Then COVID in any case actually created a fear cycle in the people's mind where people are not able to get together. So many industries are there. Certain sectors, certain companies actually will not see the light of the day for a long time. Be it restaurants, travel industries, etc., aviation. Though the aviation sector is open, but 50% they are opening. And until the travel industry picks up where people can actually get together, the aviation cannot come to the full port. Likewise, when you see the gym and the banquet hall, somebody has mentioned. So, lot of actually industries got affected. So, their COVID impact, one is COVID impact to the companies which were running well, and one companies which were actually on the verge of revival also got impacted. So, government has taken the initiative to take care of those companies which are impacted with the COVID, which was standard as on March 2020, 1st March 2020. But what about those companies which are under stress, which were not standard, but they got impacted because of the COVID? Otherwise, the revival would have been benefited. So, government has actually not talked about them. So, one thing is that needs to be taken thereafter. Another thing is the opportunities. There are many companies actually, as I think Anju Madam also mentioned, that there are companies which got benefited because of the COVID also, like telecom is there, logistics is there, Zoom is there, Netflix is there, all these companies which can, rather today we are having the web conference because of the opportunity which is so open by the COVID only. Otherwise, these things were never happening. So now, definitely, certain sectors, FMCG sector, pharma sector, got benefited, but there are a couple of sectors which have got like crucified completely. So that government was to take action to take care of all the sectors put together. So that is why they were to bring the standard restructuring, one-time restructuring. So now, how it is different from the other earlier one-time restructures? Earlier restructuring was basically, purpose is always different. It was for the companies which are specifically into the problem, but here government was to bring in across the board for various sectors. Earlier restructuring, like 7 June 2019 circular, those are more specific in nature and those are more subjective in nature. Here basically something must be brought in, objective parameters were to be defined so that it can be implemented. Which government has attempted very well to take up that issue and brought in the expert committee, and expert committee gave its certain leverage factors and liquidity factors as well as sustainability factors. Because when you do for whole, it has got to be done like that only. So that way, I think my kudos to the government for having taken up such this thing. Other thing is like restructuring, the earlier restructuring is basically for the adverse situations. Here we were actually getting to the special situations, which is because of the impact of the COVID. But while doing so, government also took initiative that how it can be made more like disciplined way, how it can be done more disciplined so that it can be followed. So now in the earlier restructuring, if supposing the bankers are also not, bankers are always reluctant. Here bankers are forced to, if supposing they come together and they sign the resolution plan, they are supposed to come together and actually take it forward. Otherwise, the provisionings, they will have to make the higher provisioning. At the same time, borrowers also, if earlier they were in default for 90 days, they can always create SMA 1, SMA 0, SMA 2 by delaying the payments. But here, after the resolution plan is taken, within 30 days, if they don't make the payments vigorously and in a disciplined way, after 30 days, they will actually be put under the review period. And if they don't make the payments, so it will slip into state to NPA. So that way, it is actually more disciplined. It is disciplining the borrowers also, it is disciplining the bankers also. But as I think Mr. Subhash also pointed out one thing, that there are a whole lot of companies which are left out of this, and it was ought to happen because you cannot cater to everyone's demand. But there are particular sectors like NBFC. And why I'm trying to point out the NBFC, because NBFC is the one which is giving to a lot of MSMEs, loans to MSMEs, to small borrowers, etc., etc. So now what is happening? The asset side is getting restructured for the finance companies. Asset side, they are restructuring because NBFCs are also forced to restructure their borrowers account. But there is no restructuring is allowed to NBFCs. What I'm telling you, try to address this issue by bringing PLTRO and PCG schemes so that liquidity can be. But what is happening? All these NBFCs, whatever schemes government has brought in so far, PLTRO and PCG, banks are not able to do the justice to the scheme because they are actually lending to only the big NBFCs, either AAA rated NBFCs, or when if it is PCG scheme, they would try to lend it to the A rated NBFCs. So the purpose for which the government has brought in all these schemes, and that is the one of the reason why government has not brought NBFC into the ambit of this restructuring. That the government is providing liquidity to them. That is why there is no need to provide any restructuring mechanism to the NBFCs. But it is not the case because most of the NBFCs are left behind. They are not able to get, they are not getting the proper liquidity support from the system, which otherwise is ought to be received. So that is why our suggestion is this: like one-time restructuring is offered to industries, it should take care of the NBFC sectors also. Apart from this, my another suggestion is this: there are several industries which would not see, like unorganized sector particularly. If you see unorganized sector, there is a barber, there is a vendors on the corners, people are afraid to go to them. So couple of sectors will not see the light of the day. People, government has to be actually wary of the fact that these sectors also needs to be protected, and some kind of scheme like wherein some industries, particularly aviation industry, restaurant industry, and couple of other industries which have been crucified with this, government should bring in some kind of equity support. Although they have brought in, actually when it needs to be focused in the one-time restructuring also, if equity is needed to match these ratios, etc., government should provide such kind of equity support to them also, either by way of grant, but like in interest on interest. Government has to actually shell out. When the Supreme Court will give the decision, ultimately they will have to give in the form of grant only. Similarly, some kind of whenever equity support is required, government should come forward and brought in the equity a contribution by some way to such kind of one-time decision. That is what I. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Mr. Manocha. Very valid points. You said that, look, this is an extraordinary kind of situation. Earlier, people were already in trouble, but now the action has taken by the government. You also said that NBFCs needed support, and you talked about equity type of support given by government. The government can form equity, can partial loan guarantees also. If they were to give a loan guarantee, that can be treated, loans can be given more easily. That is why the emergency credit line has proved that helpful. Let me turn to Mr. Agarwal, who unfortunately has not had an opportunity to speak so far. Mr. Subhash Agarwal.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Seshadri. Thank you, ASSOCHAM, for conducting this seminar. I'm listening since morning. My speakers are telling very good points, and I think this conference should be very fruitful to all the panelists as well as audience. Mr. Sunil Minow pointed out that there are no right and justice is being done by banks or by RBI to NBFC. They are supposed to do restructuring. They are supposed to do moratorium, but on liability side they are not getting the equal treatment. Actually, what is happening? Banks are having lower trust on. They are depositing a lot of money with RBI at a 3.35% interest, so and they are not lending it. That liquidity is not a problem for the banks. Only that trust is missing. Lending to the borrowers. So RBI should give proper instructions, or they should not they should reduce the interest rate for banks, or they should find some alternative. Because they should start lending and instead of depositing the money, because this is a abnormal time, COVID-19, and this restructuring scheme. I would also like to congratulate KV Kamath committee, KV Kamath and their 4 members for bringing out this report within 1 month. That is excellent job they have done, and almost this recommendations. Their recommendation is very good. There is no doubt in it. Liberty has not been given to the banks. Perhaps if banks are allowed, indicative instructions would be okay, but some liberal conditions should be there. They can individually they can understand the borrower, and they can liberalize certain terms and conditions. 5 ratios are given; they are very strict. So we have to reduce, or otherwise they have lower and upper limit they have fixed, but some liberation is required. So I think broadly job has done very fantastic. We have to ensure that NBFC should get lending. There should be alternative mechanism of getting loan from banks. Like debt market is not developed, we have to see that debt market should be developed in an efficient way. Then these problems can be resolved, and resolution can be done fastly. Confidence should be created, borrowers should be told that their credit rating will not be affected because this is a deferment of your installment and principal and interest, no reduction in compromise in interest and principal amount. So I think moreover, broadly, scheme is good, restructuring is good. That 50 lakh crore, which is after COVID stress with the banks, that it has to be tackled very businessman way. And things will be better since as predicted by RBI today, governor, that 9.5% contraction in GDP in this year, perhaps next year maybe 4-5% GDP can be there positive side, and after 22 it should be 7-8%, but 2 years stress would be there, and that have to be understand by the RBI, banks, government, and everyone has to put their role in an efficient way so that borrowers and economy overall should run efficiently, and things which can be handled without making affected more should be handled properly. I think, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. You are handling very well since morning. You are moderating very well. I would like to congratulate Mr. Shadri. Thank you very well.
Thank you, Agarwalji. Thank you very much for your very pertinent comments, all very appropriate. May I request Mr. Arun Saxena? I'll come back to you, Mr. Goman. Just give me a minute or two. Mr. Saxena has not spoken so far, and it's been remiss of me. I've not been able to get this to him so far. Please go ahead, sir.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Shadri, for giving me the opportunity to say something on this scheme. Unfortunately, for some time, I was not connected with this for half an hour or so. I should be excused if I am repeating something. And so far as I have, most of the points have been covered by all the eminent speakers. But as a lawyer, I have some issues in this scheme which can be better if it could have been clarified in clear way in the scheme itself, and whether it can be clarified later on also. First of all, the date given is 1st March, 30 days overdue. Instead of a 30 days overdue is very short period. If it is considered that as on 1st March, it should not be NPA, it should be, that would have been far better and more opportunity to more industries and the borrowers. Second thing, the implementation period, it is said that for corporate, it's a 180 days, and for individuals, for 90 days. It's not clear whether partnership forms and the proprietorship forms will come into the individual portion, or it will come into the corporate. Third is very important, is related to this time period itself. I think Mr. Anil Goel will agree with me that the time limit provided in IBC since beginning, we have seen not adhered to due to various reasons. So many sectors, the time limits were extended, and first of all 270 days, 180 days, then 270 days, then 330 days, and even so many matters are pending after 330 days also. So I am not finding anything in the scheme. If time limit is not maintained, what will happen? Whether restructuring will fall out, or there is a scope for extension of the time at any level, whether it's a level of the board of the bank itself, or any other level. Third thing I would like to say is credit rating. I think some speaker has already been uh, mentioned that credit rating is required, and what kind of the credit rating is acceptable. Probably it is RP4. If RP4 is the criteria, that I doubt the most of the companies will be able to avail this scheme, because we have seen the June 2019 scheme also, and due to this RP4 credit rating, a lot of borrowers are not able to avail that scheme. Third thing, I am very particular about the time limit of the moratorium. That is 2 years. See, if we see the present circumstances, 1 year is almost going to happen and passed. Scheme implementation always says within 31st March, within 180 days from the this December invocation of the restructuring scheme. So 2 years may not be very reliable period or related period for the borrower, so many borrowers. Third thing I will say, that the conversion of the equity. There is a provision that the resolution plan can have the conversion of the equity. Conversion of the equity, it's a good plan, but we have seen in S4A schemes also lot of confusion on the valuation at the time of the conversion. First thing that has to be considered. Second thing is, if during this scheme some merger or acquisition or some group company merger is allowed, that would have been very beneficial to some of the big group companies. And lastly, I will say that this scheme, I find it's a deferment of the liability of the borrower only, because not much benefit will be given to him. Neither there is a reduction of the interest, neither there is a reduction in the principal during this moratorium period, or there is not much financial benefit to the borrower. With this, I will just close my comment, and I thankful to the ASSOCHAM for giving me an opportunity to share my views on this scheme. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Saxena. Very succinctly put. Very good points that we have taken note of, and we will ensure that we intercede appropriately with all the elements that we deal with on a continuing basis. With this, I'll request Mr. Ghuman, who wanted to say something, to go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Shashadri. So I was also listening to my co-panelists, and I think there are two sides of the coin. The one is on the demand side, and I think we all agree that every sector has been impacted because of this. Some very severely, some mildly, and some even got affected positively. I think on the supply side of the financing, we have banks, we have NBFCs, we have other investors. As far as banks are concerned, I don't think there is any problem related to their sources of funding and all that. They are paying almost an all-time low interest to the borrower, to the depositors. Their funding costs are also at all-time low. The regulator has given them so many windows to assess financing. I think the only problem the banks are facing is risk aversion and the decision making. What this new circular does is, it kind of facilitates at least decision making to a certain extent. The only thing that should be tackled would be the risk aversion, and there I think the government or maybe regulator should come up with some sort of credit enhancement, some sort of let's say first loss guarantee, or some other credit risk mitigation, so that the banks can restart the lending. As far as NBFCs are concerned, I agree with the panelists. They have all sorts of problems. There is a problem in terms of how they have sourced the funding and managed their liabilities till now. There is a problem in terms of they have to restructure the borrowers loan, but they are not getting the same kind of flexibility from their fund providers, which are mostly the banks. And also the fact that some of the special schemes which were introduced by RBI, those have been used up by, unfortunately, by those companies or those NBFCs who do not have that kind of a pressing need. So I think, as we say that, we should never waste a crisis. We should, perhaps it's a time for NBFCs to have a business model rethink. They may perhaps move away a little bit from borrowing in the short term and lending in the long term. And as we have seen, in the past as well, I think the need of the hour is picking up action over perfection. India is a large country. If we keep on solving for everything, we may probably not get anything and we'll miss the bus. So whatever we have currently, I think without moving too many blocks, we should request the regulator, we should request the government to frame the policies, but get them into action quickly because that's what is needed currently. And I think that's what is the need of the hour on the borrower side. That's what is required in the NBFC sides.
Thank you, Mr. Govan. You brought the subject back to the NBFCs and the fact that they don't have access to liquidity, and they've been subject to an asymmetric movement in the sense that on the one hand, it's supposed to give moratorium, on the other, they are not getting the moratorium themselves. So we appreciate that. I think if I may opportunize this discussion, and I apologize if I miss out anything, and if there's anything I miss out, if you could just let me know and then we'll add it. So I think fundamentally the panel was of the view that the one-time restructuring was a very good idea and in fact necessary and something that is required to be done. However, there is a belief that the way in which it has been set up may not help a very large number of companies because of various reasons that were mentioned, including the stringency of some of the financial parameters that have been mentioned by the committee. So under the circumstances, perhaps a more principle-based approach, saying that if an entity is viable and the banks believe that it is viable, they should have the ability to restructure and ensure a future approach. Also of the view that the NBFCs, which currently are not covered by this, should be given access to the restructuring window so that they can continue to support the very many customers that they currently support. There was a discussion on building trust. There is a trust deficit between the lender and the borrowing entity. That has to be bridged in some form. And it is very important that that happen because otherwise the entire restructuring process itself will prove to be very difficult. There was discussions on the credit rating. There was a view that many borrowers are not willing to approach the bank restructuring on account of their belief that their credit ratings may get adversely impacted, which will have a long-term impact on the entity. Discussion as to how the credit rating of these entities will be dealt with so that they are not at a permanent disadvantage. There was a discussion on time period. There was a belief that the time period which has been mentioned in the document is very stringent and it is difficult to achieve in reality, and therefore the need to change the time period. There was also a discussion on the a priori conditions at which the restructuring is possible, i.e., the fact that it needed to be a standard account with not more than 30 days past due on the 1st of March 2020. The view was that needs to be relooked because there may be viable entities that perhaps don't meet that requirement, but are viable and need to be saved in the interest of both society. And finally, there was discussion on M&A, that M&A needs to be encouraged to ensure that the majority of these entities continue to survive. If there's anything that I have missed out, if you can tell me, I will add it appropriately. So let me throw this open to the panel. If there's anything that's been missed out, kindly do point it out, and we'll add it to this list.
Yeah, I think, Mr. Shishadri, one of the segment of the market which is restructuring for MSMEs, while quite straightforward, but if any of the panelists have a view on that, while that circular is simple, I have one small challenge or the problem which especially NBFCs are facing towards the restructuring and the provisioning norm. If you may allow, I may put that forth
Please go ahead.
for the panelists.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So, sure. So this is a problem which is with respect to the provisioning norm, and this problem arises out of the fact that not systematically important NBFCs are under IND-AS regulation, and the provisioning norm which RBI provides. So, for example, under the MSME restructuring circular, if an NBFC restructure a loan, it has to provide a provision of 5%. However, given that these NBFCs are under IND-AS and that is driven by the accounting standard of which is outside that, the accounting standard still requires you to make provision basis a probability of default scenario, and that creates a non-homogeneous nature of provisioning. So between two different NBFCs which are restructuring loans may be doing different kind of provisioning. One may take a harder view on their underlying portfolio and stress arising out of it. One may just do it lesser. So this anomaly, which doesn't exist for the banks, and they follow IRAC norm. If RBI and Ministry of Company Affairs has to work jointly to make sure that when it comes to the provisioning norm, RBI supersedes IND-AS accounting guideline for at least for the financial institutions.
No, it's a valid point, Mr. Nath. I think we are signatories, and we need to move to IFRS 9, which is what has created this IND-AS accounting standards. And I think the banks were supposed to have moved to IND-AS 2 years ago, or maybe 3 years ago, and it's being pushed back every year on account of the enormous financial cost that the transition will impose on the banks. As to when they, and as of this moment, NBFCs are at albeit a little bit more subjective than what the banks do. But we'll take note of that, and we will write we will publish it as part of the minutes. We'll also include this request for a discounted liquidity window as part of the minutes. Anything else that we need to talk about?
I think you have taken here. You told very nicely summarize the position. Whether you can mention about the 5 ratios, financial ratio, which is backbone for any, you can say, restructuring, that should be looked into. Because these 5 ratios are playing a very important role. Whether the company can do it, this is also a very question mark. When people are coming to us and talking to these ratios, I think that is a most important aspect, whether something can be done for these ratios. I think in summarized position, what you can suggest from the ASSOCHAM, whether it can be relooked. Sure.
Sir, what we are going to say is that a more principle-based approach is. Go ahead.
Yes, you can say like that. It should be acceptable, and most important issue is the conversion of the debt into equity. This is also a most important aspect. Are the bankers are very reluctant to consider all such aspects to debt into equity because they have to make 100% provision for that. And they should have to value as 1 rupees. That is a major issue.
No, I agree with Mr. Gupta, and that's what we, as practicing as a consulting organizations, we see that the banks are not taking these kind of decisions like conversion of debt into equity, and they would only be focusing on some kind of interest rebate and also some kind of deferment in the repayment. And the third thing, which is very reluctantly coming from the banks, is the additional funding. So if a person is already stuck up and the business is already at the verge of closure and he needs immediate support, then the additional funding is not available. Once the additional funding is not available, it is expected from the same entrepreneur that he would invest from his own pocket, will bring the unit to a working condition, and then will repay the installments and with a deferment of 2 years. So while we all are, Mr. Shashadri, we have observations on the scheme, but there are some good things about this scheme that I would also like to say, and that should be recorded as an outcome of this event. One, that as Madam Padmaraja Chundru said, that the banks have started taking actions on this. The banks have formed their own board approved policies, and those policies are available. I would simply request to unmute in case you are not speaking, because there is a from the background. Will please okay. So the banks have said that they are actually they have uploaded the schemes on the websites, and the borrower can check their eligibility. The very important part is that the banks are required to make lower provisions, 10% in the case of corporate loan, 5% in the case of MSME, that actually will motivate banks to take faster. The third is that it is very important that there is a committee for more than 1,500 outstanding loan. There is a committee, and there is an expert committee which would be vetting the resolution plans, and that actually would be a very, very comfortable situation for the banks. And since the final decision and the final vetting would be done by the expert committee, so the bankers would not be haunted after 5 years that some decision was taken at some time 5 years back. So that's also a very, very comfortable situation. So the ultimate objective of the overall scheme of RBI is that the enterprise must continue. Second, the enterprise must continue to employ. So with these schemes, I think there are many such situations which actually can be said that it is positive. However, the observations are also very important, and that should be indicated to the policy.
Thank you, Mr. Goel. A very valid point. So, take a note of that. So there's one gentleman who wants to ask a question. Mr. Yogesh, please go ahead.
Hello, thank you for the opportunity for asking the question. It has been a learning experience listening to what the experts have been saying during the entire session. My question is around would for the entrepreneurs and for the companies who will be availing the benefits of this loan, one-time loan restructuring, would those be at least in the short term be overshadowed or like over diminished by the rising inflation rates? Because the government has been injecting a lot of stimulus, and so would that be a factor?
I think we'll turn the question over to Ms. Sharma, who is as a representative of the rating agencies, perhaps an economist by trade. So, would you want to answer that question?
While there is inflation, and that would sort of counter the impact of the one-time restructuring that is granted. At the same time, we should also note that the GDP is contracting by nearly 10% this year. And while there will be a certain set of people who are getting impacted, what is required is liquidity, and that is what this is giving, along with whatever moratorium was granted earlier. But there is one more aspect which I don't know whether ASSOCHAM has actually found from their members, is that the corporates also find that the one-time hit of interest which has come after the moratorium, what to do with it is becoming an issue, with also where the bankers have not provided clarity. Some bankers have provided clarity, some have not. So that is where some sort of confusion is there on that front as well. And inflation by itself, yes, it will impact, but primarily demand has to pick up, and only then we can see any long-term benefits from whatever liquidity and whatever restructuring that this grants. Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Sharma. I think the point is that thank you, Ms. Sharma. I think to Yogesh's question, the initial thought process was that demand destruction would have a deflationary effect. But when reality was seen, we found that there were so many obstacles to business that there was a cost push inflationary pressure that was coming through, which was very surprising. Initially, when the economy was contracting so heavily, the expectation was that there would be a deflationary force that comes into being, in spite of very significant liquidity being put into the system. Under the current, hopefully those will moderate. The expectation is that they will moderate as we go forward because of a base effect, and also because good monsoon that we've had. What impact that's going to have on individual businesses is dependent upon those individual businesses. Very difficult to actually answer that question. So with that, I think I'd like to thank everybody who's taken the time to be here today. It's been a scintillating conversation. We'll try and distill the essence of what we talked about today and send it to all of you so that once you approve, we will publish it as the minutes that arise from this meeting. So thank you very much once again for taking the time to be with us. It's been a positive pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you, ASSOCHAM.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think
it's a pleasure.
If you give, I think Ankush, sorry, Anil Goyal. I request Mr. Anil Goyal to actually give us the formal vote of thanks, if that's possible.
Thank you very much.
My apologies, I overlooked this.
No, I think we've already done the conclusion part of it. Part of it was done by you, part of it was done by me. All the discussions, all the observations that we kind of collated together. And that's what is the concluding remarks. We definitely see that there are positives in this scheme, and there are some observations which actually may need some kind of amendments. And overall observation, overall concluding remarks today in this event would be that yes, the scheme would be utilized by few only and not by everyone. The sectoral analysis done by the expert committee is also good. They have finally supported a policy that any sector which is not doing well, there should not be an effort to put good money against the bad money, because that sector is already bad. So they have identified sectors where the stress is lesser, and then the support has to be given to those sectors, because this is basically, this scheme is only for COVID infused default. This scheme is not for any other thing. For other things, there are many other schemes. Maybe 7th June 2019 is there, IBC is there, FACI is there, but this particular scheme is only and only for COVID infused the defaults. I would also say, well, when the banks will come for providing a remedy, the banks will also see whether the impact of the COVID on your business is seen, or it is the other way, a different kind of scenario which is there. So if the banks would say that this is a COVID infused default, then this kind of remedy would be available under this framework of RBI scheme. With this, first of all, I thank ASSOCHAM for organizing such an event where everyone discussed and observed on a scheme. More specifically to Dr. Rajesh Singh, who is doing a lot of hard work, and he's been interacting with all of us. We in the absentia, we actually would like to thank the key speakers today, like Madam Padmaja Chundru and Mr. Garg, Mr. Ashwin Parikh, because he actually gave us a complete view how the committee thought about bringing this scheme. So with all, I convey my heartiest thanks to all the speakers, and most important is the participants. And without the participant, none of us would have been here. It is all because of the participants that we are here, and we are connected with you, and we are trying to analyze a particular subject. With this, I once again thank everyone and I conclude the remarks. Thank you very much to everyone. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us today. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye, sir.
Bye. Bye.